Hey there, and welcome back. Let the evening come down around you now, soft and slow, and let the day you have had loosen its hold and slip away. This is a long, unhurried night, made for a whole life told from its first day to its last, laid out gently for anyone who would rather drift back into the deep past than lie turning in the present. I would like to take you a long way tonight, 600 years, across to a green corner of England, and up into the dangerous heart of a royal court, into the story of a woman who climbed higher than almost any woman of her age, from the quiet manor of a country knight to a duke's bed and a duke's crown, until she stood one heartbeat from being queen. You need do nothing at all but breathe and let the years come to you, one after another, the way mist comes up off a river at dusk. And when you are ready, we will begin where she began, in the ordinary world of the English gentry. Long before anyone dreamed that this particular girl would one day walk barefoot through the streets of London with a candle in her hand and a whole city come to watch her shame. Before we go back, one small and easy thing, and then I will leave you in peace with the story. If the slow telling of a full life is the kind of company you like to keep on nights such as this, you are welcome to stay and welcome to subscribe, whichever way your listening lets you. And these quiet histories will find their way back to you whenever you want them. I go looking through the old chronicles and the faded records for the lives that make good company in the small hours, the ones that history has half forgotten, and I lay them out slowly in their proper order, the way I am about to lay out this one. There is nothing at all you need to do about it tonight. Only let me know, in your own good time, if these evenings are something you would like to keep. That is all of it. Now let it go, and come back with me. Picture this. A soft rolling country of low hills and deep lanes, of oak woods and hop gardens and little rivers running clear over chalk in the southeastern corner of England, where the land leans down toward the narrow sea and France beyond it. This is Kent, in the last years of the 14th century and the first of the 15th, a rich and settled shire of yeomen and knights and old church lands, its manors tucked into the folds of the hills, its parish churches grey and square above the villages. Among these manors, on the borders of Kent and Surrey, where the Weald rises toward the downs, stands the moated house of a family called Cobham, of the branch that held the manor of Sterborough, a family of the middling gentry. Not great lords, but solid, respectable, well-connected, the kind of family that sent its sons to the wars and its daughters into the households of the mighty. And in that house, somewhere around the turn of the century, in a year no record troubled to set down, a daughter was born to Sir Reginald Cobham, and they called her Eleanor. We know almost nothing of her beginnings, and that itself is worth pausing on, for it tells us how far she was to travel. The great of the land had their births recorded, their horoscopes cast, their infancies noted by chroniclers who knew a future king or queen when they saw one in the cradle. Eleanor had none of that. She was the daughter of a knight, not a lord, and no one writing in the year of her birth would have wasted a line on her, for there was nothing to mark her out. She would have been reared as such girls were, in the moated manor among the Kentish hills, taught her needle and her prayers, and the management of a household, taught to read a little, and to carry herself well, and married off, in the ordinary run of things, to some neighbouring gentleman with a manor of his own. That is the life she was born to, a life that would have left no trace in history at all, a country lady among 1,000 others, remembered by nobody. It is one of the strange truths of her story that we can say more about the manner of her disgrace than about the whole of her childhood. And we must furnish that childhood, as we so often must with the women of that age, from what we know of the world she grew up in, rather than from anything the records tell us of the girl herself. So let us set her there, gently, in the country of her first years, and let her grow a while in the mind, before the great world comes for her. Picture the moated manor in its hollow, the still green water about its walls, the hall with its smoke-blackened beams, and its fire in the centre of the floor, the household gathered at the long tables, the coming and going of servants and grooms, and the priest who kept the little chapel. Picture the child learning the round of the year in such a place, the ploughing and the harvest, the great feasts of the church, the killing of the pig at Martinmas, the frost on the moat in winter, and the May blossom in the lanes in spring. Picture her taught to sit a horse, and to sew a fine seam, and to say her hours, and growing, as the records hint she did, into a young woman of unusual beauty and unusual quickness of mind. The sort of girl a country household is proud of, and a little wary of at once. For beauty and wit in a gentleman's daughter were assets to be spent in the marriage market. But they were also, as this story will show, with a terrible clarity, dangerous things for a woman to carry too high into the world of the great. Eleanor had both, and she would carry them very high indeed, higher than anyone born in that moated manor could have imagined, and the carrying of them would be the making and the unmaking of her. That is exactly where we are going next, out of the quiet Kentish manor and into the household of a great lady. For it was through service in a noble house, the ordinary path by which a clever girl of the gentry might rise, that Eleanor first came near the blaze of royalty, and the household she came into was one of the strangest and most quarrelsome in all of England, for it belonged to a prince of the blood royal, the youngest brother of the great warrior king, and to the foreign princess he had married in one of the most scandalous matches of the age. To understand how a knight's daughter from Kent came to stand one step from the throne, we must first understand that prince and the ruinous marriage that opened the door through which she walked. His name was Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, and he is the second central figure of this evening, and his story and hers are so wound together that from here on we cannot tell the one without the other. Humphrey was the youngest of the 4 sons of Henry IV, that Bolingbroke, who had taken the crown of England from his cousin Richard and founded the House of Lancaster. His eldest brother was Henry V, the victor of Agincourt, the greatest soldier England had produced in generations, the king who came within sight of making himself master of France. The second brother was Thomas of Clarence, who died in battle in the French wars. The third was John, Duke of Bedford, steady and able, the best and most balanced of them all. And Humphrey, the youngest, Duke of Gloucester, was in many ways the most brilliant and the least wise of the 4. He had fought beside his brother at Agincourt as a young man and been wounded there, struck down and stood over by the king himself while the battle raged around them, so that there was true courage in him and a share of the family glory. But he had also inherited a full measure of the Lancastrian pride and ambition, without his eldest brother's iron self-command. And he was rash where Henry had been calculating, and quarrelsome where Bedford was patient, and he made enemies as easily as he made friends. Yet there was another side to the Duke, and it is the side that earned him, for a time, the loving name by which the Londoners knew him, the good Duke Humphrey. For he was a man of learning such as few princes of that rough age ever were, a genuine lover of books and scholarship, a patron of poets and translators, a correspondent of the learned men of Italy, where the new learning was just then beginning to blaze up. He gathered one of the great libraries of his day and gave a precious part of it to the University at Oxford, where the room built to house his books would carry his name for centuries after, long after the scandals were forgotten. He wanted to be thought magnificent, cultivated, the very pattern of a princely patron, and in that at least he genuinely was. So picture him as Eleanor would first have seen him, a prince of the blood in his 30s, a wounded hero of the Great War, brilliant and generous and vain, surrounded by books and scholars and flatterers, ambitious past prudence, and married, disastrously, to a foreign princess he had taken more for her lands than for herself. He was a dazzling and a dangerous man to come near, and Eleanor came very near indeed. The great event that shaped all their lives had happened in the year 1422, when Eleanor was still a young woman finding her way in the world. In that year, Henry V, the Conqueror, died suddenly in France, worn out by campaigning, still only in his middle 30s, at the very height of his triumph, leaving as his heir a baby not yet a year old. The throne of England and the vast claim to the throne of France that Henry had all but made good came down upon an infant in the cradle, Henry VI, a child who would grow into the gentlest and most disastrous king England ever crowned. And because a baby cannot rule, the government of the two realms fell to the dead king's brothers. Bedford, the abler one, took charge of France and the war. Humphrey was left to England, named protector and defender of the realm during the long minority, the first prince in the land, uncle to the little king, until that little king should grow up and marry and have a son of his own, the heir to the throne. That last fact is the hinge of everything that follows. So long as Henry VI had no child, Humphrey of Gloucester stood next in line to the crown itself, and the woman Humphrey married would stand next to be its queen. But the protectorate did not make the Duke master of the realm, and this was the great grievance of his life. Power was held not by him alone, but by a council of lords. And at the head of the men who checked and thwarted him stood his own great uncle, Henry Beaufort, Bishop of Winchester, later a cardinal of the church, one of the richest and most formidable men in the kingdom. Beaufort was everything the Duke was not: cool, patient, immensely wealthy, a lender of money to the crown itself, a churchman of vast worldly skill, and he and Gloucester loathed one another with a steady, poisonous hatred that ran for 20 years and shaped the whole politics of the reign. Their quarrels more than once brought the city of London to the edge of open fighting. The Duke, popular with the commons of London, who loved his open hand and his hatred of the proud cardinal, could rouse the city, but Beaufort had the money and the patience and the long game, and slowly, over the years, it was Beaufort's faction and its allies who gained the upper hand, and Humphrey who was pushed by degrees toward the margins. This is the world Eleanor married into, a court of two armed camps, a prince on the losing side of a long feud, and enemies who would one day find that the surest way to bring down the Duke was through his wife. The marriage that opened Eleanor's path was Humphrey's first, and it was a wild and reckless business from the start. In the early days of the little king's reign, there had come to England a foreign princess in distress, Jacqueline of Hainaut, the heiress of great lands in the Low Countries, of Hainaut and Holland and Zealand. A young woman unhappily married to a cousin, she despised and eager to be free of him. She fled to England, seeking help, and there she caught the eye and the ambition of Humphrey of Gloucester, who saw in her not only a spirited and attractive woman, but a vast inheritance of rich territories waiting to be claimed by a bold enough husband. And the Duke was nothing if not bold. Although Jacqueline's first marriage had never been lawfully dissolved, although the church had not freed her, he married her anyway, on the strength of a doubtful ruling from one of the rival popes of that divided age, and set about planning to make himself, by right of his new wife, a great prince of the Low Countries. It was a disaster, and it was a disaster that reached far beyond the couple themselves. Humphrey took an army across the sea to conquer Jacqueline's counties, and the venture failed, and worse than failed, for it flung him into open quarrel with the mightiest prince in that part of the world, Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, who was England's most necessary ally in the long war against France. To pursue his wife's lands, Humphrey had endangered the whole English cause abroad, and his brother Bedford and the council at home were aghast. The campaign collapsed. He came home, leaving Jacqueline behind, to fight on for her inheritance, and at last to lose it, besieged and captured and forced in the end to give up her claims. and when the matter came at last before the Pope for judgment, the ruling went against him. Jacqueline's first marriage was declared to have been valid all along, which meant that her marriage to Humphrey had never been a marriage at all. In the year 1428, the whole tangled business was undone, and the Duke found himself, in the eyes of the Church, a single man once more, free to marry where he chose. And here is where Eleanor steps out of the shadows and into the light of history, for she had been there all along close by, watching. She had come into Jacqueline's household as one of her ladies-in-waiting, one of the well-born young women who attended the great princess. And it was in that service, in the intimate world of a noble woman's chamber, that she had come to the notice of the Duke. Somewhere in those years, while Humphrey was still bound to Jacqueline, Eleanor became his mistress, his companion in all but name, the woman he turned to and could not do without. It was not, by the hard standards of that court, an unusual thing for a great lord to keep a mistress among his wife's attendants, and the chroniclers, when they came to write of it later and in anger, would make much of the sin of it, the lady-in-waiting who supplanted the mistress she served. But we should be careful, for those chroniclers wrote after her fall, when it suited everyone to blacken her. And we cannot now know how much was calculation on her part, and how much was simply the old story of a powerful man and a beautiful young woman thrown together in the closeness of a household. What we can say is that by the time Humphrey was freed from Jacqueline, it was Eleanor he wanted and her. He would have. So he married her. Once the Church had dissolved the doubtful union with Jacqueline, he took Eleanor Cobham to wife, and the knight's daughter from the moated manor in Kent became, at a stroke, the Duchess of Gloucester, the wife of a prince of the blood, the sister-in-law of the late conqueror of France, and one of the very first ladies of the whole kingdom. It was a rise so steep that it must have taken the breath from everyone who watched it, and it made her, in the eyes of the older nobility, an upstart, a woman risen above her proper station, a former waiting maid who now took precedence over ladies born to far greater blood. That resentment, quiet at first, would matter enormously in the end. But set it aside for now and think only of the height she had reached. She was young, she was beautiful, she was clever, and she was married to the man who, so long as the young king had no child of his own, stood next in line to the throne of England. If the gentle boy on the throne should die without an heir, as boy kings so often did, then Humphrey would be king, and Eleanor Cobham, the knight's daughter, would be Queen of England. That possibility, dazzling and dangerous, hung over her whole marriage, and it was the thought of it, we shall see, that led her at last into the trap that destroyed her. For a dozen years and more, she lived at the very summit of the world, and they were, by every sign we have, glittering years. As Duchess of Gloucester, she kept a great household of her own. Waited on by the daughters of noble houses, as she had once waited on Jacqueline, robed in silks and furs, hung with jewels, attended wherever she went with the state and ceremony due to a princess of the blood. She rode in the great processions of the realm. When the young king was crowned and the court kept its high festivals, she had her place among the foremost, and men and women who had been born far above her now gave way to her and bent to her precedence. She shared her husband's brilliant and cultivated court, his books and his scholars and his poets, and she was herself, by all accounts, a woman of real intelligence and curiosity, drawn to learning, drawn to the new ideas that flowed through Humphrey's circle, drawn, and this would matter more than anything, to the study of the stars. She and Humphrey seemed to have been genuinely devoted to one another, a well-matched pair, both clever, both ambitious, both in love with magnificence, and if the marriage wanted anything, it wanted only the one thing she could not give him. For the years went by, and she bore him no child that lived, but there was a shadow over all this splendour, and it was cast by the very steepness of her rise. To the old nobility of England, Eleanor Cobham was, and always would be, a jumped-up gentlewoman, a former lady-in-waiting who had climbed into a duke's bed and out of it into a duchess's coronet, a woman who wore her precedents like stolen goods. The great ladies whom she now outranked did not forgive it, and the chroniclers, most of them churchmen, with a churchman's disapproval of a woman who had risen through what they saw as sin, wrote of her with a curled lip. They said she had trapped the duke by unfair arts. They whispered, even in the good years, that she had used charms and potions and the help of a certain sorceress to bind Humphrey to her and make him marry her, that no honest means could account for so great a rise. It was the kind of thing that was always said of a woman who climbed too high, the reaching for witchcraft to explain what envy could not bear, to credit to a woman's own wit and beauty. But it was a dangerous kind of gossip to have attached to your name, for it lay there quietly, season after season, waiting, and when the day came that powerful men wanted a weapon against her husband, that old whisper of sorcery was lying ready to their hand. For the ground beneath Humphrey was shifting all through this time, slowly and then faster, and as he sank, Eleanor's high place grew perilous. The great matter of the age was the war in France, the war that Henry V had so nearly won, and that his son was now, little by little, losing. The tide had turned against the English. A peasant girl of France had appeared and set the French cause alight before she was taken and burned, and after her the French recovered their strength and their heart. England's great ally, the Duke of Burgundy, abandoned the alliance and made his peace with the French king. The able Duke of Bedford, Humphrey's brother, the man who had held the whole English position together, died worn out at his post. And as the war soured, England divided into two bitter parties. Those who wished to fight on and recover by force what was slipping away, and those who wished to make peace and cut the losses before all was gone. Humphrey was the loudest voice of the war party, the champion of his dead brother's conquests, and against him stood the peace party, led by the rich old Cardinal Beaufort, and, rising fast behind the cardinal, a smooth and powerful courtier named William de la Pole, the Earl of Suffolk, who had the ear of the young king. Slowly the peace party won. Humphrey was outmanoeuvred in the council, his advice set aside, his influence hollowed out, and the once mighty protector became, by the end of the 1330s, a prince increasingly shut out from real power. Popular still with the London crowds, but beaten at the council table, watching younger and cleverer enemies gather the government into their hands. And in all of this, Eleanor was not a bystander. She was Humphrey's wife and his partner, proud and clever, and by every account, ambitious for him and for herself, and she stood with him in his losing struggle. She would have felt every slight to him as a slight to her, every advance of Beaufort and Suffolk as a threat to her own high place, and she would have known, none better, what hung upon the one great question that still, in spite of everything, protected them both. For all Humphrey's decline, one hard fact remained unaltered. The king, Henry VI, was still unmarried and still childless. And until that changed, Humphrey of Gloucester was still the heir to the throne, and Eleanor was still a single death away from being queen. It was the thing that kept them dangerous to their enemies, even in defeat, and it was the thing that Eleanor, in an hour of pride or fear or simple curiosity, could not leave alone. She wanted to know what the future held. She wanted to know whether the crown would come to her husband. And in that age, if you wished to know the future, you went to the men who read the stars, and that was a door that, for a woman in her position, opened straight onto the scaffold. We must understand, before we go on, just how deadly a game it was that the Duchess now began to play. For to us, the reading of the stars seems a harmless folly, and in that age it was anything but. Astrology, then, was not the plaything of the idle, but a serious learned art, studied at the universities, practiced by grave scholars, believed in by nearly everyone from the ploughman to the pope. A science that claimed to read in the motions of the heavens the destinies written there by God. Great men kept astrologers as they kept physicians, and consulted them on when to travel, when to marry, when to give battle. There was nothing shameful in casting a horoscope, but there was one horoscope that no subject might safely cast, and that was the king's. To calculate the nativity of the reigning king, to work out from the stars of his birth how long he would live, and when and how he would die, was held to be treason of the deepest dye. For it was reasoned that a man who sought to learn the hour of the king's death must be imagining that death, wishing it, perhaps working to bring it about. To compass or imagine the death of the king was the very definition of high treason under the law of England, and to seek it in the stars was to step straight into the shadow of the axe. And this was the door that Eleanor, in her pride and her fear and her hunger to know what was coming, chose to open. Around her husband's cultivated court there moved men learned in these arts, and two of them in particular she drew into her service and her confidence. One was Roger Bolingbroke, a scholar of real reputation, a man deep in the study of the heavens, and it was said, in darker studies, still the kind of learned clerk who kept strange instruments and stranger books. The other was Thomas Southwell, a priest, a canon of the King's own chapel of St. Stephen at Westminster, a man of the church who dabbled where a churchman should not. These two, at the Duchess's urging, undertook the forbidden thing. They cast the horoscope of the king, Henry VI, calculating from the stars the course of his life, and fatally, the prospect of his dying. And the reading they drew from the heavens was that the young king would fall, before long, into a grave and dangerous sickness, an illness that might well carry him off. It was exactly the answer Eleanor had, in some corner of her heart, wanted to hear, for the death of the childless king would set her husband on the throne and the coronet on her own head. But it was also, the moment it was spoken and written down, a sentence of ruin. For there is no more dangerous knowledge in a kingdom than a prophecy of the king's death cast by the wife of the man who would inherit his crown. There was a third figure in it too, and she is the one the common people remembered longest. A woman named Marjorie Germain, whom the Londoners called the Witch of Eye, from the Manor of Eye near Westminster, where she lived. She was not a scholar like the others, but a cunning woman, a wise woman of the sort every district had, who sold charms and potions and remedies, who was believed to be able to procure love, or a child, or the ruin of an enemy, by arts that stood on the shadowy border between old country magic and outright sorcery. She had been in trouble with the law before for exactly such practices, and Eleanor had dealings with her, had bought from her, by her own later admission, potions and philtres, medicines meant, so the Duchess would swear, to help her at last to conceive the child she and Humphrey so wanted. Whether that was the whole truth or only the least damning part of it, we cannot now say. But when the storm broke, all of them were swept up in it together. The learned astrologer, the meddling priest, the cunning woman of Eye, and at the centre of them the Duchess of Gloucester, and the charge that bound them all was the blackest that could be brought, that they had conspired by sorcery and by the forbidden arts to compass the death of the king. How it came to light we do not exactly know, whether by an informer or a careless word, or the deliberate work of enemies who had been watching and waiting, and given how perfectly the whole affair served the interests of Humphrey's foes. There have always been those who suspected that it was less an accident than a trap, sprung at exactly the right moment to destroy the Duke through his wife. However it began, in the summer of the year 1441, the thing was suddenly out in the open, and the machinery of the law closed upon it with terrible speed. Roger Bolingbroke was arrested first, taken with his instruments and his books, and the government made a great and deliberate show of him. He was set up on a high scaffold at Paul's Cross, the open-air pulpit beside the cathedral where all London gathered, and there he was displayed to the crowds like a trophy. Seated in a painted chair hung about with the tools of his forbidden craft, made to confess before the whole city that he had practiced the black arts, so that everyone might see the sorcery that had been at work at the very heart of the realm. And in his confession, whether freely or under the pressure that such men were put to, he named the Duchess of Gloucester. He said that he had done what he had done at her asking. And with that naming, the storm that had been gathering for years over Eleanor Cobham broke at last full upon her head. When Eleanor understood what was coming, she did what the desperate did in that age. She fled to sanctuary, taking refuge in the great abbey at Westminster, where by ancient custom the church's holy ground protected even the accused from being seized. But sanctuary could shield a body from arrest, and it could not shield a duchess from the reach of the church's own courts, and it was to the church that she was now summoned to answer. For the charges against her were not only treason, but sorcery and witchcraft and heresy, and these were crimes that the spiritual courts claimed for their own. So she was brought, this proud great lady, who a few weeks before had ridden through London in silk and jewels above the heads of the realm, to stand before a solemn assembly of bishops and doctors of the church and answer for her soul. At the head of them sat the aged Archbishop of Canterbury, and among them, we may be sure, sat the interests, if not always the person, of her husband's great enemy, the Cardinal Beaufort. For the men who judged her were not friends of the House of Gloucester, and everyone in England understood that the real target behind the Duchess was the Duke. The charges laid against her were many, article heaped upon article, and they ranged from the merely damning to the utterly deadly. It was said that she had long consorted with the Witch of Eye and bought her sorceries. It was said that she had procured the casting of the king's horoscope and the forbidden prophecy of his death. And it was said, most terrible of all, that she and her accomplices had made an image of the king in wax, and had set it before a slow fire, so that as the wax softened and ran and wasted away, so too the life of the young king should soften and waste and drain out of him by the working of the spell, until he died. This was the ancient and dreaded charge of image magic, the murder of a man by melting his likeness. And it was murder and treason and devil's work all bound into one, and to be convicted of it was to be as good as dead. Eleanor faced it as best she could. She admitted some of what was charged and denied the worst of it. She confessed that she had indeed had dealings with Marjorie Germain, that she had gone to the cunning woman and bought her potions, but she swore that she had done so for one reason only, that she was childless and longed to give her husband an heir, and had sought the wise woman's medicines to help her at last to conceive. She denied utterly that she had ever sought the death of the king. Whether the judges believed her, or whether it mattered what they believed, the outcome was never truly in doubt. She was found guilty, not, in the end, of the full treason of compassing the king's death, for that might have sent even a duchess to the fire, but of sorcery and witchcraft, of dealing with the powers of darkness, of the practices that the potions and the horoscope and the whispered old rumours all seemed to prove. And because she was the wife of a prince of the blood, they could not deal with her as they dealt with the common sort. They found instead a punishment fitted to her rank and calculated to destroy it. Her marriage to Humphrey was declared dissolved, undone, annulled, on the ground that she had won him in the first place by the very sorceries she was now convicted of, so that at a stroke she ceased to be Duchess of Gloucester and became merely Eleanor Cobham once more, a convicted witch, stripped of her title, her precedence, her place at her husband's side, everything she had climbed so high to win. And then, that all the world might see how far she had fallen, they sentenced her to a public penance through the streets of London, and after it, to imprisonment for the rest of her natural life. She would keep her head, she would lose everything else, and she would lose it in the fullest glare of public shame that the age could devise. The penance came in the grey of that November, and it is the scene that fixed Eleanor Cobham in the memory of London forever. The picture that even now, when almost all else about her has faded, still comes down to us across the centuries. On 3 separate days chosen to fall on the busy market days when the streets would be most thronged, she was brought out to walk in penance through the heart of the city. They took from her the silks and the furs and the jewels of a duchess, and dressed her in the plainest of clothes, and they bared her head, and they took the shoes from her feet, so that she went barefoot over the cold cobbles and the filth of the winter streets. Into her hand they put a candle of wax, a taper to be carried lighted before her, the humble penitence offering to be laid at last upon an altar. And so, on each of the 3 days, she walked a bareheaded, barefoot woman in a shift with a candle in her hand, from the waterside where the barge set her down, through the crowded streets, to one of the great churches of the city, to make her offering and her public submission before God and the people came to watch. That was the whole point of it. The reason such penances were done in the open street and on the market days, that the shame should be witnessed by as many eyes as possible, that the mighty brought low should be seen by the low to be brought down. The Londoners, who a little while before had bent the knee to her, as she rode above them in her glory, now lined the streets in their thousands, to see her creep past on bare feet in a plain gown. And among them, we may be certain, were faces she knew, courtiers and citizens and servants who had once been proud to be noticed by the Duchess of Gloucester. What it cost her to walk that road 3 times over, under all those eyes, we can only imagine. She had been one of the first ladies of the kingdom, a woman, a heartbeat from a crown. Now she walked the gutter like a common penitent, her feet bleeding on the stones, her disgrace made into a public spectacle for the entertainment and the warning of the whole city. The chroniclers who described it could not quite hide beneath their moralizing a kind of awe at the completeness of the fall, the greatest lady of them all reduced in a few short weeks to this. And yet there is something in the accounts, read carefully, that suggests she did not break. She walked, she carried her candle, she made her offerings. She did what she was ordered to do, 3 days running, and she did it, so far as we can tell, with a kind of hard composure, neither collapsing nor pleading. A proud woman, enduring the worst that could be done to her pride, and refusing to give her enemies the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. It is easy, across 600 years, to make of her only a victim or only a schemer, and she was surely something of both. But in that long, cold, public ordeal, there is also the outline of a woman of considerable strength, a knight's daughter who had climbed higher than any of them, and who now, having lost it all, would at least lose it on her own 2 bare feet, upright, without a word. When the 3 days were done, they gave her no rest and no reprieve. She was taken from the city and delivered up to her keepers, and the long second half of her life began, the imprisonment that would have no end but death. In castle after castle, far from London, far from Humphrey, far from everything she had been, the bright half of her story was over. The dark half, longer and quieter, and in its way more terrible, was about to begin. Her companions in the affair fared worse than she did, for they had not the shield of princely rank, and their ends are part of the darkness of her story. Roger Bolingbroke, the learned astrologer who had cast the fatal horoscope and then named her from the scaffold, was condemned as a traitor and put to the death reserved for traitors in that pitiless age. He was drawn through the streets to the gallows at Tyburn, and there he was, hanged and cut down, still living and butchered, and his head was set upon London Bridge, and the quarters of his body sent to be displayed in distant towns. A warning in torn flesh to any other scholar who might be tempted to read too deeply in the stars of kings. At the very end, upon the ladder, he is said to have protested that he had never meant treason, that he had done nothing to harm the king, but it availed him nothing, and he died the full horror of a traitor's death. Thomas Southwell, the priest who had helped him, cheated the hangman in the only way left to him, for he died in the Tower of London the night before he was to be brought out to execution, whether of sickness or of terror, or, as some whispered, by his own contriving, so that he went to his grave from a prison bed rather than from the gallows. And Marjorie Germain, the witch of Eye, the cunning woman at the bottom of it all, met the end that the age kept for her kind. She had been in the church's hands before for her sorceries and had been let off with a warning, and that made her, in the law's eyes, a relapsed offender, one who had returned to her wickedness after being spared. And for such there was no mercy. She was taken to Smithfield, the open ground outside the walls, where the great fires were lit, and there she was burned. It is a grim measure of how the same crime fell so differently upon different heads, that of the four chief figures caught in this net. The great lady walked in penance and lived out her years a prisoner. The astrologer was torn apart as a traitor. The priest died in his cell, and the poor cunning woman was burned alive. The highest and the lowest of them, meeting the softest and the hardest of the fates. It says everything about that world, that rank could turn even ruin into something survivable, and that the woman with neither name nor protection paid in the end with her body in the fire. But the true prize of the whole affair, the reason so many now believe it was less an accident than a hunt, was not any of these. It was the Duke. Humphrey of Gloucester was not himself accused, not touched directly by the charges against his wife, and yet the ruin of Eleanor was the ruin of Humphrey, and everyone understood it. His enemies had struck at him through the person dearest to him, had made his own household the seat of treason and sorcery, had stripped him of his wife and covered his name with the filth of the scandal, and there was nothing he could do to save her or himself. He did not, so far as we know, lift a hand to defend her, and perhaps he could not, for to defend a convicted witch was to share her guilt, and Humphrey, whatever his faults, was fighting for his own survival. So he stood aside and let it happen, let his marriage be dissolved and his wife led away to prison, a broken and diminished man. And the once great protector of England sank in these last years into a kind of political twilight. Shorn of his marriage, shorn of his power, waiting, though he did not know it, for the last blow to fall. It fell 6 years later, in the year 1447. By then, the peace party had wholly triumphed. The young king had been married to a French princess, Margaret of Anjou, a formidable and determined young woman brought in by Humphrey's enemies, and the policy of peace with France, which the Duke had fought all his life, was carried through over lands his brother had died to win. Humphrey, the last great voice of the old war party, the king's own uncle, was now more an obstacle than a power, and his enemies resolved to be rid of him for good. A parliament was summoned to meet at Bury St. Edmunds, far from Humphrey's friends in London, and when the Duke arrived, he was met not with honour, but with arrest, taken into custody on a charge of treason got up against him. And then, within a very few days of his arrest, before any trial could be held, Humphrey of Gloucester was dead. The government gave it out that he had died of a sudden sickness, a stroke or a seizure brought on by the shock of his fall, and it may well have been so, for he was no longer young, and the blow was heavy. But half of England believed then, and many have believed since, that the good Duke was quietly murdered, done away with by the men who had hunted him down, and his body was shown in public afterward, unmarked precisely to still the rumour, which of course it did not. So he too was gone, the brilliant, reckless prince who had raised Eleanor to a coronet and could not save her from the fall. And Eleanor herself, shut up in a far-off castle, learned that the man for whom and with whom she had climbed so high was dead, and that whatever faint hope she might still have nursed of rescue or restoration had died with him. The imprisonment that filled the rest of her days was not a dungeon and not a torment of chains, for she was still, whatever the courts had done to her rank, a woman of great blood by marriage, and not to be treated as a common felon. It was something quieter, and in its long, slow way, perhaps crueler, an honourable captivity that would simply never end. She was given into the keeping of a trusted lord and his men, and she was moved from stronghold to stronghold across the years, held now in one great castle, and now in another, always guarded, always watched. Always at the far edge of the kingdom from the London where she had shone, she was kept for a time at Chester, in the castle above the river, and at Kenilworth, that mighty fortress in the Midlands, and then she was carried further still, out to the Isle of Man in the cold northern sea, held on that remote island where her keeper was lord, about as far from the centre of things as a prisoner could be sent without leaving the king's dominions altogether. And at the last she was brought to Beaumaris, the great water-girt castle on the island of Anglesey off the coast of North Wales. And it was there, within those grey walls, with the sea and the mountains of Snowdon beyond them, that she came at last to the end of her long captivity. Think of what those years must have been. She had perhaps 10 or 11 of them, shut up in one castle after another, a woman growing old in confinement, her husband dead, her title stripped away, her name a byword for sorcery and disgrace across the whole kingdom. She had climbed from a moated manor in Kent to the second highest place among the women of England, had worn the silks and the jewels, and stood one death away from a crown. And now she sat in a guarded chamber in a far northern fortress, watching the sea, listening to the gulls and the wind, with nothing before her but more of the same, until she died. There would have been no more processions, no more scholars and poets, no more precedents, and no more power. Only the slow round of the days in the keeping of her guards, the seasons turning outside the narrow windows, the long silence of a life that the world had decided to forget. Whether she spent those years in bitterness or in some hard-won peace, we cannot know, for she vanishes almost entirely from the records once the great scandal is past. And the woman who had been at the centre of the loudest sensation of the age slips away into a silence as deep as the one she had come from. She died in the summer of the year 1452, at Beaumaris, a prisoner to the end. No great funeral marked her passing. No monument was raised over her that survives. No chronicler paused for long over the death of the fallen duchess in her far-off castle. She who had been so much talked of in her rise and her ruin died almost unnoticed, an old prisoner in a Welsh fortress, and was buried we are not even quite sure where. Her grave as lost to us as the year of her birth. It is a strange and fitting symmetry that a life we cannot date at its beginning, we can barely locate at its end. That she came out of the silence of the unrecorded gentry and returned into the obscurity of the forgotten prisoner. And that all we can see clearly is the blazing arc in between, the rise and the fall, the coronet and the candle in the cold street. But that arc is one of the most remarkable of the whole medieval age, and there is a great deal still to say about what it meant, about the world that raised her and destroyed her, and about why the fall of Eleanor Cobham struck her own time, and strikes us still with such a strange and lasting force. So let us not leave her yet in her Welsh castle, but turn back and look more closely at the forces that shaped her, beginning with the thing that undid her. The dark and tangled fear of witchcraft that ran like a buried current beneath that whole glittering age. To understand why the charge of sorcery could bring down a duchess, we have to step for a while into the mind of that age and its fear of the unseen. The people of the 15th century, from the poorest cottager to the most learned bishop, lived in a world they believed to be thick with hidden powers, a world in which prayers and curses worked, in which the saints healed and the devil tempted, in which the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was thin and everywhere crossed. In such an age, magic was not a fairy tale, but a genuine and present danger. Ordinary folk went to cunning men and wise women for charms to cure a sick beast or find a lost ring or win a reluctant lover, and thought little of it. And yet the same arts, turned to harm, were held to be able to sicken. Above all, there was the terror of image magic, the belief that if you made a likeness of a person, in wax or clay, and worked upon it with the right words and rites, pierced it or melted it or buried it, then the living person would suffer and waste and die as their image was destroyed. It was one of the oldest and most widespread of all human fears, and it was exactly the crime that Eleanor was accused of working upon the king. And the church, which had once been inclined to dismiss much of this as peasant superstition, was in these very centuries hardening its view, coming to teach that such magic was real, that it worked by the power of demons, and that those who practiced it had, knowingly or not, made themselves servants of the devil. The learned treatises that would in later ages fuel the great witch hunts were only just beginning to be written, but the frame of mind was already forming. The belief that witchcraft was not merely a fraud or a folly, but a genuine diabolical conspiracy against God and man and the ordained order of the world. Into that frame of mind, a charge like the one against Eleanor fitted with terrible ease. A woman had consulted astrologers, and a cunning woman. A likeness of the king had, it was said, been melted before a fire. To the men who judged her, and to the crowds who watched her penance, this was not a far-fetched slander, but a plausible and frightening thing, an outbreak of the devil's work at the very heart of the kingdom, and the horror of it made her guilt, in the public mind, almost a foregone conclusion. It is very hard to defend yourself against a charge that everyone is already half prepared to believe. But here is the deeper and darker truth of it, the thing that lifts Eleanor's story out of mere superstition and into politics for the fear of witchcraft, precisely because it was so genuine and so hard to disprove, made the most perfect political weapon that a scheming enemy could wish for. If you wished to destroy a great person, and above all a great woman, and could find no ordinary crime to pin on them, then a charge of sorcery was ready to your hand. It was almost impossible to refute, for how does one prove that one has not, in secret, worked a spell? It carried an aura of religious horror that turned the public against the accused before a word of defense was spoken, and it could be attached, with a little effort, to the perfectly real and perfectly ordinary things that people actually did. The visit to the wise woman, the casting of a horoscope, the potion bought to help conceive a child, all of which could be made to look, in the right light, like the trappings of devilry. Eleanor had done these ordinary acts, as many great ladies did. Her enemies took them and built from them a scaffold. And she was not the first, nor would she be the last, to be brought down in exactly this way. Only a generation before her, another royal woman had been struck by the same weapon, for Joan of Navarre, the stepmother of Henry V. The Dowager Queen of England had been accused of seeking the king's death by witchcraft, and had been stripped of her wealth and held prisoner for years, an accusation that, most conveniently, delivered her rich dower lands into the crown's empty treasury just when the war most needed the money. Few truly believed the old queen a witch. The charge was a tool, and everyone knew it, and when the money had been squeezed out of it, she was quietly released and restored, the whole business having served its purpose. In Eleanor's own day and after, the same pattern would repeat, great men and women accused of sorcery whenever it suited their rivals to be rid of them. The charge reached for again and again because it worked. So when we look at the ruin of Eleanor Cobham, we should see it for what it most likely was, not simply the just discovery of a real witch, though she had certainly dabbled where she should not, but the calculated destruction of a woman, and through her of her husband, by enemies who found in the age's deepest fear the perfect instrument for their purpose. And it is worth dwelling too on the particular danger of being a woman who had climbed as Eleanor had climbed. For her sex and her low beginnings together made her the most natural target in the world. A woman in that age held no power in her own right. Whatever height she reached it through a man, as daughter or wife or mother, and her place stood only so long as his did, and fell when his fell. Eleanor's whole greatness was borrowed from Humphrey, and it could be taken from her the moment he was weakened, which is exactly what happened. But there was more to it than that, for ambition itself, so admired in a man, was held to be an ugly and unnatural thing in a lady, and one who was seen to want power, to reach for it, to enjoy it, stirred a deep unease that curdled easily into hatred. When such a one rose high, men looked for a sinister explanation, because they could not or would not credit that a lady had risen by her own gifts. She must have used arts. She must have bewitched the man. The very success of an ambitious lady was taken as evidence that something unnatural was at work, and the whisper of witchcraft followed the clever, beautiful, upward-climbing figure as her shadow followed her in the sun. Eleanor had climbed higher and faster than almost any woman of her century, and she had done it, in the disapproving eyes of the world, by supplanting the mistress she served and winning a prince away from his wife. Everything about her rise offended the settled order. Her sex, her ambition, her low birth, the manner of her marriage, and all of it lay stored up as resentment, waiting. When her husband's enemies wanted a way to destroy him, they did not have to invent her wickedness from nothing. They had only to give shape and legal form to what half the court already muttered, that the upstart Duchess had risen by sorcery and would stop at nothing, even the death of the king. To rise further still, the charge fitted the woman the world already believed her to be. That is the cruelty at the heart of it, that her strengths, her cleverness and her beauty and her will to rise were turned into the proof of her guilt, so that the very things that had lifted her up became the rope that pulled her down. Her story is, in this, the story of many women of power in that age, and long after, admired and envied in their rising, and destroyed, when the moment came, by the same qualities that had made them great. Turn now for a while to the man at the centre of her fortunes, to Humphrey himself, for he deserves more than the role of a broken husband who could not save his wife, and his own tragedy runs close beside hers. He was, for all his political failures, one of the most remarkable princes England ever produced, and the thing that made him remarkable was his love of learning. In an age when most great lords could barely read and cared for nothing but war and the hunt, Humphrey of Gloucester was a genuine scholar and a passionate collector of books, at a time when a book was a costly handmade treasure, each one copied out by hand over months of labour. He gathered hundreds of them, the classics of Rome and the new learning of Italy, works of history and philosophy and poetry, and he did not merely hoard them, but read them and had them translated and shared them. He reached out across the sea to the scholars of Italy, where the great revival of ancient learning was just then beginning, and drew them into correspondence, employed them, brought the first breath of that new dawn of the mind into England, and in an act of far-seeing generosity, he gave a large part of his precious library to the University at Oxford, hundreds of volumes, to be kept and studied there. And the room they built to house them bore his name for centuries, so that long after his political world had crumbled to nothing, students still read beneath the memory of the good Duke Humphrey. There is a deep and sad irony in this, that the thing Humphrey did, which truly outlasted him, truly mattered, was not his politics or his wars or his grasping after his wife's foreign lands, all of which came to ruin, but his books, his quiet gift to the life of the mind. The Londoners called him the good Duke while he lived, loving his open hand and his championing of the old glory against the peacemakers, and after his death, when they believed him murdered, the name stuck to him as to a wronged and gentle prince. And there grew up around his memory a whole folklore, tales and sayings that kept his name alive among common people who knew nothing of libraries. He was not, in truth, a very able ruler, nor even a very good man in the hard sense. Being proud and rash and self-serving by turns. But he loved beauty and learning truly, and he lifted a knight's daughter to a coronet for love, and he was destroyed by cleverer and colder men. And there is enough in that to understand why his own age half mourned him, and why his memory kept a certain warmth. His wife's story and his are the two halves of a single tragedy, the brilliant doomed prince and the ambitious, doomed woman he raised beside him. Both of them reaching for more than their world would let them hold. Both of them broken by the patient enemies who waited for them to overreach. To see the whole meaning of their fall, we must lift our eyes from the two of them and look at the kingdom they lived in. For Eleanor and Humphrey went down at the beginning of one of the unhappiest passages in all of English history, and their ruin was one of the first cracks in a wall that would soon come crashing down. At the centre of it sat the young king, Henry VI, and he was, of all the men who ever wore the English crown, perhaps the least fitted to wear it. He was gentle where the age demanded hardness, pious and unworldly where it demanded cunning, meek and yielding where it demanded a strong hand on the reins. He wished harm to no one, founded schools and colleges, prayed and gave alms, and was in his private character very nearly a saint, and as a king he was a catastrophe. He could not master his quarrelsome nobles, could not hold the balance between the factions, could not make a decision and hold to it, and later in his life his fragile mind gave way altogether, and he sank for a time into a helpless stupor from which nothing could rouse him. Under such a king, the government became a prize to be fought over by whoever could seize it, and the great men of the realm circled the weak centre like wolves, and the whole ordered structure of the kingdom began, slowly, to come apart. Abroad, everything that Henry V had won was being lost. The long war in France, which Humphrey had fought all his life to continue, was ending in defeat and humiliation, province after province falling away, until, within a few years of Eleanor's death, almost nothing was left of the great English empire in France but the single town of Calais. The soldiers came home, beaten and unpaid, and angry. The cost of the failure fell on a government already despised, and the blame for it poisoned the politics of the realm. And at home, the factions that had destroyed Humphrey turned, with him gone, to destroying one another, until the quarrel between the great houses broke out at last into open war. The long and bloody struggle for the crown between the descendants of the old king's sons that men would afterward call the Wars of the Roses. Eleanor did not live to see the worst of it. Dying in her island prison a few years before, the fighting began in earnest. But she had lived through its beginnings, had been herself one of its early victims, for the vicious factional hatred that struck her down was the same hatred that would soon set the whole kingdom cutting its own throat. And there is a particular, pointed irony in the timing of her fall that is worth pausing on, for the place she had been reaching toward, the place she had cast a king's horoscope to try to secure, was filled within a few years by another woman entirely, and filled with a vengeance. When the peace party triumphed over Humphrey, they married the young king to a bride of their own choosing, Margaret of Anjou, a French princess of fierce will and high spirit, and it was she who became the great queen of that generation, she who wore the crown and wielded the power that Eleanor had dreamed might one day be hers. And Margaret proved to be everything the age feared in a powerful woman, and everything Eleanor had been accused of being: ambitious, determined, ruthless in the defence of her husband and her son. A queen who took the reins of a cause into her own hands and led armies and made and unmade men. Where the Duchess had been destroyed for reaching too near the throne, Margaret sat upon its steps and fought for it tooth and claw, and was hated for it as bitterly as Eleanor had ever been, and came in the end to her own ruin in the wars, her son killed, her cause broken, herself a captive, and then an exile. It is as if the role she had grasped at passed her by and settled on another, and brought that other, in the end, to a fall as complete as her own. The place beside a weak king was a cursed place for an ambitious woman, and whoever stood in it, the Duchess reaching for it, or Margaret seizing it, was broken by it in the end. So Eleanor's story, which might look at first like a single strange scandal, a duchess and some astrologers and a wax image, opens out when we stand back from it into something much larger. A window onto a whole kingdom sliding toward ruin. The weakness of the king, the viciousness of the factions, the loss of the war, the readiness of powerful men to destroy their rivals by any means to hand, the terrible vulnerability of women who reached for power in a world that would not forgive them for it. All of these are written in her fall. She was not a great mover of events. She was, at bottom, a victim of them, caught and crushed between forces far larger than herself. But because she stood so high when the crushing came, her ruin lit up, as a lightning flash lights, a whole dark landscape, the shape of the storm that was gathering over England. That is part of why her story is worth the telling, not only for its own strange drama, but for what it shows us of the age that made it. Let us go back, though, and look more closely at the men who were drawn down with her, and at the strange and perilous world of learning they inhabited. For it tells us much about how knowledge itself could be a dangerous possession in that age. Roger Bolingbroke, the chief of them, was no village conjurer, but a scholar of standing. A man learned in astronomy and mathematics, and the natural philosophy of the schools, the kind of clerk who understood the movements of the planets and could calculate a horoscope with real skill. In his own eyes, and in the eyes of many, what he did was a science, a branch of learning as respectable as medicine or law. The reading of the influences that the heavens were believed to pour down upon the earth and upon the lives of men. But the trouble with such learning was that it stood always on a knife edge. On one side of the edge lay lawful, natural philosophy, the study of the stars and their ordinary effects, which the church tolerated. On the other side lay necromancy, the summoning of spirits and the working of spells, which the church damned as trafficking with devils. And the line between the two was faint and shifting, and could be redrawn by a hostile judge exactly where it would do the most harm. When they arrested Bolingbroke and displayed him at Paul's Cross, they made a great show of his instruments, and the show was itself part of the accusation. They set him up in a curious painted chair, and about him they arranged the tools of his craft, the charts and the metal instruments, for reading the heavens. And so it was said, wax and images, and the apparatus of darker workings, so that the watching crowd should see with their own eyes that this was no mere astronomer, but a dabbler in the black arts. Whether all those objects were truly his, or whether some were added to make the picture more damning, we cannot know, but the effect was the same. A scholar's study, with its strange diagrams and its brass instruments and its books full of symbols that ordinary people could not read, looked to the frightened and the ignorant exactly like a wizard's den. And the same learning that in a settled time would have been honoured was now paraded as proof of devilry. It is a sharp reminder that in such an age to know too much, to study too deeply, to possess books and instruments that the common run of men could not understand, was itself a kind of danger, and that the scholar who served the great could be turned in an afternoon into the sorcerer who had corrupted them. And then there was the machinery of the law that closed upon Eleanor herself, and it too repays a closer look. For it was a strange, two-edged thing. When she fled to sanctuary in the Abbey at Westminster, she was invoking one of the oldest protections of the medieval world, the right of the church to shelter the hunted on its holy ground, where the officers of the crown could not lawfully seize them. Sanctuary could save a man from the hangman, at least for a time. but it could do nothing to save Eleanor, and the reason is revealing. For the charges against her were not only the crown's business, but the church's, since sorcery and witchcraft and heresy were sins against God, and fell under the jurisdiction of the spiritual courts, and it was to a court of bishops, not to a royal judge, that she was summoned to answer. The very institution whose sanctuary she had sought was the institution that now sat in judgment on her, and there was no fleeing from that. She stood before churchmen, many of them tied to her husband's enemies, and they examined her soul as well as her deeds, and against their spiritual authority the walls of sanctuary were no protection at all. The sentence they passed on her was, in its way, as revealing as the trial. They did not send her to the fire, though the charge of compassing the king's death by sorcery might, in strict law, have justified it, and though the poor Witch of Eye was burned for far less rank. Eleanor's blood, or rather the borrowed greatness of her marriage, saved her life, for it was one thing to burn a cunning woman of the London slums, and quite another to burn a woman who had been, until yesterday, the wife of the heir to the throne. So they found a subtler ruin for her. They unmade her marriage, which destroyed her rank and her name at a single stroke, and turned her from a duchess back into a commoner. They sent her through the streets in penance, which destroyed her honour before the eyes of all. And they shut her up for life, which destroyed her future without the mercy of a quick end. It was a punishment carefully weighed to strip away everything she had gained, while leaving her alive to know the loss of it, year after year, in a far-off cell. There is a cold cleverness in it that fits the whole affair, which was from first to last less a matter of justice than of the calculated, patient, thorough destruction of a woman and a house. Let us go and sit with her a while in those years of captivity, for the records give us only the bare names of the castles that held her, and the imagination must do the rest, and it is worth doing, for the places themselves tell a kind of story. Think first of Kenilworth, that vast fortress in the heart of England, its great red stones rising from the wide mere of water that once lay all about it. Its huge hall, built by the very house of Lancaster, into which Eleanor had married, echoing, and grand, and cold. To be held there was to be held in luxury of a sort, in a princely castle, and yet to be kept all the same. Able to walk the walls and look out over the water and the parkland, and know that none of it was freedom. Think then of the far graver exile that followed, when she was carried away out of the heart of the kingdom altogether, north and west, to the very edge of the sea, and set down at last upon the Isle of Man, that lonely island in the cold grey waters between England and Ireland, where the wind never quite stops, and the sea is always there beyond the walls, and where a prisoner might stand and look out at the water on every side and understand exactly how far she had been carried from everything she had known. And think, last, of Beaumaris, where the end came, one of the great water castles raised long before by the conquering King Edward to hold down the Welsh, a low, immensely strong fortress of concentric walls ringed by its own moat drawn from the sea. Standing on the flat shore of Anglesey with the narrow strait before it, and across the water the great mountains of Snowdon, rising blue and cloud-wreathed into the western sky. It is a beautiful and a desolate place, and it was the last thing Eleanor Cobham's eyes would have rested on, those grey walls and that bright water and those far mountains, day after day, season after season. For the years it took her to die. Picture her there, in her later age, a woman who had worn cloth of gold and now wore plain wool, who had ridden through cheering London and now walked a castle yard by the sea, sitting perhaps at a narrow window with the light off the strait on her face, watching the tide come and go, the boats of the fishermen, the gulls turning, the mountains changing colour as the day wore round. Whatever was in her mind in those long hours, the memories of her rise, the bitterness of her fall, The faces of the dead we shall never know. She left no word, no letter, no confession beyond the ones wrung from her at her trial. She simply endured in that beautiful, lonely place until she endured no more. And when she died, the silence closed over her almost at once. And here we must speak of how little we truly know and why, for it shapes everything we can say of her. Nearly all that was written of Eleanor Cobham was written by men who had every reason to think ill of her. The chroniclers of her age were, for the most part, London men and churchmen, and they recorded her rise with disapproval and her fall with a kind of grim satisfaction. The proud upstart Duchess getting her deserts, the witch unmasked, the moral plainly drawn. They give us the shape of the great public events, the horoscope, the arrest, the trial, the penance, the imprisonment, because these were matters of common knowledge and public spectacle. But they give us almost nothing of the woman inside the events, her thoughts, her feelings, her own account of what she had done and why. Her voice comes down to us only in the words her accusers put in her mouth, and even her one recorded defense, that she sought the wise woman's potions only to conceive a child, reaches us through hostile pens. We are left to reconstruct her, as we so often must reconstruct the women of that age, from the outside, from the record of what was done to her, rather than of what she was, and to be honest about how much of her remains, and must remain, in shadow. Yet she did not vanish from memory, as completely as she vanished from the records, for a story as dramatic as hers does not die easily. And in the centuries after her death, Eleanor Cobham lived on as a kind of legend. A stock figure of the proud woman brought low, retold by later poets and players who found in her fall a perfect fable of ambition and ruin. In their hands, she became a warning. The great lady who reached too high and dabbled in forbidden arts, and was cast down into shame, and something of the real complexity of her story was flattened into a moral. That is the fate of the famous fallen, to be turned into a lesson, their tangled human truth smoothed into a tale that suits the teller. But beneath the legend, the real woman is still faintly visible, the knight's daughter from Kent. Clever and beautiful and unwilling to stay in the small place the world had marked out for her, who climbed by her own gifts and a prince's love to the very edge of a crown, and who paid for the climbing with everything she had. She is worth remembering as she was, and not only as the fable made her, and that is part of what we are doing here tonight, giving her back, for a few quiet hours, something of her own true and complicated humanity. There is an old image that the people of the Middle Ages loved above almost any other, and Eleanor's life might have been made to illustrate it, and that is the Wheel of Fortune. They pictured Fortune as a blindfolded woman turning a great wheel, and bound to the rim of the wheel were the figures of men and women. And as she turned it, some were carried up toward the top, crowned and triumphant, while others, who had been at the top a moment before, were flung down toward the bottom, broken and despairing. It was their favourite way of thinking about the changeableness of the world, about how the highest are brought low and the mighty cast down, and they carved it in their churches, and painted it in their books, and preached it from their pulpits. A constant reminder that no earthly greatness was secure, that the higher you rose, the further you had to fall, and that Fortune, who had lifted you, would as carelessly let you drop. To a man or woman of that age, the story of Eleanor Cobham would have seemed almost the perfect embodiment of this truth. A woman swept up by Fortune's wheel from a country manor to the very summit of the world, crowned in all but name, and then, in the turning of a season, flung down to the very bottom, shamed and imprisoned and forgotten. And they would have drawn from it the moral they always drew, that she had climbed too high, that pride goes before a fall, that she who had reached for a crown had been justly humbled. and that the wise soul sets no store by the treacherous gifts of fortune, but fixes its hope on heaven, where alone there is no falling. It is a satisfying moral, and there is truth in it. For Eleanor did reach very high, and did fall very far, and there is a terrible symmetry in her rise and ruin that seems to cry out for such a reading. But we, looking back, need not be quite so quick to close the book on her with a tidy lesson about pride, for the wheel of fortune, comforting as it was, hid as much as it revealed. It made the ruin of the great look like the impersonal working of fate, a turn of the blind wheel, when in truth, Eleanor was not simply dropped, she was pushed, and pushed by particular men with particular purposes, who used the age's fears and the age's law as their instruments. The image of that blind turning let everyone avoid the harder question of human responsibility, of who exactly had destroyed her and why, and whether it was just. It is a beautiful image and a false comfort, and part of seeing Eleanor clearly is seeing past it to the real and human machinery of her ruin. So what, in the end, are we to make of her? When we have stripped away both the chronicler's moral and the legend's fable, and tried to see the woman as she was. The honest answer is that she was neither the black sorceress of her enemies, nor the pure innocent victim that a kinder age might wish to make her, but something more human and more interesting than either. She was, beyond much doubt, genuinely ambitious, a woman who wanted power and position, and was not ashamed to reach for them, and who, having climbed high, wanted to climb higher still. She almost certainly did consult astrologers about the future, and it is entirely possible that she wanted to know, in particular, whether her husband would become king, which meant wanting to know how long the present king would live, which was, however she framed it to herself, a dangerous and forbidden thing to ask, and she did, by her own admission, deal with a cunning woman for potions. In all of this, she was foolish and reckless, and perhaps guilty of exactly the overreaching ambition her enemies charged her with. She was not a wholly innocent victim caught by pure malice. But that is very different from being a witch who melted the king in wax to murder him. And it is that darker charge, the treasonable sorcery aimed at the king's life, that was almost certainly the political invention, the thing built up out of her real but lesser follies, to make a crime worth destroying her for. The truth of Eleanor Cobham, as best we can reach it, is that she was an ambitious and clever woman who did some genuinely rash and forbidden things, consulting the stars where she should not, dealing with the cunning folk where she should not, and who thereby handed her waiting enemies exactly the material they needed to build a monstrous accusation and bring her down. Her real fault was not devilry, but ambition and indiscretion. In a world that punished ambition, in a woman with peculiar savagery and stood always ready to dress indiscretion up as witchcraft. She was guilty, but not of what they killed her name for. She was punished, but far beyond her deserts, and she was destroyed, in the last analysis, less for anything she had actually done than for who she was, an upstart, low-born, and the wife of a man that powerful people had decided must fall. There is a thread in this story that we let fall a long way back, and it is worth picking up again, for it holds a strange and sad symmetry. And that is the fate of the Lady Eleanor supplanted, Jacqueline of Hainault. When Humphrey abandoned her cause and came home to England, and in time took Eleanor to wife, Jacqueline was left to fight on alone for the great inheritance that had drawn Humphrey to her in the first place, and she fought bravely, and she lost. Hemmed in by the power of Burgundy, deserted by the husband who had promised to win her lands and instead had lost them for her, she was forced in the end to give up her claims and to accept the Duke of Burgundy as the heir to the counties that should have been hers. She had one last act of self-will left in her, for she married again. Quietly and for love this time, a man of no great rank, and by doing so broke the terms that had been forced upon her and lost the last shadow of her power. And then she died, still young, of a wasting sickness, having outlived her greatness and her marriages and her hopes, childless, dispossessed. A princess who had been heiress to 3 rich lands and died with none of them, set the 2 women side by side. Jacqueline and Eleanor, the wife Humphrey cast off, and the wife he took, and the symmetry is almost too neat to be borne. Both were drawn into the orbit of the same brilliant, ruinous prince. Both reached, through him, for a greatness that seemed within their grasp. And both were destroyed, in the end, by forces larger than themselves, Jacqueline losing her lands and her life to the cold power of Burgundy, Eleanor losing her rank and her freedom to the cold malice of her husband's English enemies. Humphrey, in his charming, reckless way, was fatal to the women who loved him, or whom he loved. Not through any cruelty of his own, but through the simple fact that to be bound to so ambitious and so vulnerable a man was to be dragged down with him when he fell. Jacqueline he could not make a great princess. Eleanor he could not save from prison. He raised them both toward the heights, and could hold neither of them there, and both slipped from his failing hands into ruin. There is a kind of tragedy in that too, in the prince who wished to be magnificent and brought disaster on everyone. He tried to lift. But we should not let the symmetry make us cold, for between the Duke and his Duchess there was, by every sign, something more than the mere convenience of an ambitious pairing, and it is a part of her that the harsh chroniclers had no interest in, and so we must look for it in the corners of the record. They were together as man and wife for something like 13 years, and by all the evidence they were genuinely devoted, a well-matched couple who shared not only a bed and a rank, but a whole cast of mind. They were both clever, both drawn to books and learning and the beautiful things of the world, both ambitious and proud and in love with their own magnificence. Eleanor shared in Humphrey's brilliant intellectual court, moved among his scholars and poets, and by her interest in the stars, showed that she had caught, for good and ill, something of his own restless hunger to know and to reach beyond the ordinary. Theirs was not the cold dynastic match of so many great marriages, but a bond that had begun in desire and grown into a true partnership of 2 like souls. And the one grief that shadowed it, the grief that would in the end be turned into a weapon against her, was that they had no child. For all their years together, Eleanor bore Humphrey no living heir. And in a world where a marriage was measured above all by the children it produced, this was a real and aching lack. And it was, if we believe her own defence, the thing that first sent her to the cunning woman of Ai in search of potions to help her conceive. There is a bitter irony folded into that, if it is true that the childlessness which was her private sorrow became, through the wise woman's potions she sought to cure it, the very thread her enemies pulled to unravel her. The reaching for a child led to the dealing with the witch, and the dealing with the witch led to the scaffold and the penance and the prison. Her most human longing, to give the man she loved the heir they both wanted, may have been the first step on the road to her destruction. Whether that is the true shape of it, we cannot be certain, but if it is one of the saddest turns in a story full of them, that a woman was ruined in the last account by wanting a child. Let us leave the sorrow for a while and go back, as a slow night lets us do, to the good years, and dwell for a time in the world she moved through at the height of her greatness. For it was a rich and beautiful world, and she was at the very centre of it. To be Duchess of Gloucester was to live a life of a splendour that is hard for us now to imagine, a life of ceremony and colour and precedence in which almost nothing was simple and almost everything was a display. She kept her own great household, a small court within a court, with its officers and its ladies and its servants running into the scores, its stewards and chamberlains and grooms, its cooks and clerks and musicians, all ordered in their ranks, and all serving the person of the Duchess. She was dressed by attendants in gowns of velvet and cloth of gold, lined and trimmed with the costly furs that only the great were allowed by law to wear, and hung with jewels, rings and brooches and collars and girdles of gold, worth the price of whole manors. She ate from silver and gilt, waited on at table with bended knee, her food carried in with ceremony. When she travelled, she went with a long train of attendants and baggage, and where she came, she was received with honour. And around all this material splendour ran the finer web of precedence and ceremony that meant even more, in that world, than the gold and the furs. Rank was everything, and rank was shown in 100 daily rituals, who walked before whom, who sat above whom at the table, who was served first, who curtsied to whom, and how low. As the wife of the first prince of the blood, Eleanor stood at, or near the very top, of this delicate order among the women of England, and every day of her greatness was a quiet reaffirmation of that height, in the way she was greeted, the way room was made for her, the way great ladies of ancient blood gave her place. For a woman who had begun as a knight's daughter and a lady in waiting, the daily experience of that deference must have been intoxicating, and we should not judge her too harshly for loving it, for it was the very air of that world, and she had climbed into it against all the odds. She had also, we should remember, a real part to play in the public life of the realm. A great duchess was not merely an ornament, but a power, a patron who could advance her friends and her servants, an intercessor whom petitioners approached, a figure whose favour was worth having. And Eleanor, clever and ambitious as she was, would have wielded that soft power with skill and enjoyed the wielding of it. It is worth remembering, too, that all this glittering life was lived out against the background of a whole working country, the England of the middle years of the 15th century, going about its long, slow business, far below the world of dukes and duchesses. Beyond the painted chambers and the silk gowns lay a green and populous land of villages and market towns, of open fields and sheep walks and deep woods, a country grown rich above all on wool and the cloth that was woven from it, its wealth flowing from the backs of the sheep that dotted every upland. It was a land of parish churches and great abbeys, of guild halls and market crosses, of roads deep in mud in winter and choked with dust in summer, along which moved the slow traffic of an age that walked or rode or went by river, the carriers with their pack horses, the drovers with their beasts, the pilgrims to the shrines, the friars on their rounds. In the towns the craftsmen kept their mysteries, and the merchants counted their profits, and in the countryside the great mass of the people lived by the turning seasons, much as their forebears had, close to the edge of hunger in a bad year, their lives measured by the church bell and the harvest. To most of these people the doings of the great were as remote as the weather, and Eleanor, in her glory, would have been to them little more than a distant name, a figure glimpsed perhaps once in a lifetime, riding by in a blaze of colour. And yet when she fell, it was these same ordinary people who lined the streets in their thousands to watch her walk in penance. For the fall of the mighty was one of the few things that could bring the high world and the low together, the one spectacle in which the mighty were brought down to the level of the crowd and below it. There is something telling in that the knight's daughter who rose so high above the common folk, so far that they could barely see her, came at the last right back down among them, walking barefoot on the same cold stones they trod every day, an object now not of distant awe, but of near and pitiless curiosity. The wheel that had carried her up above their heads brought her down, in the end, into the middle of the crowd, and it was the crowd that watched her go. There is a question that sits at the very heart of Eleanor's ruin. and it is one that reaches far beyond her own age into every age, including our own, and that is the deep human hunger to know what is coming. She fell, in the end, because she wanted to know the future, and above all, because she wanted to know the one thing it was most dangerous to ask: how long a certain man had left to live. It is easy to condemn her folly, but we should pause and feel the pull of it, for who has not longed, at some anxious turn of life, to lift the veil and see what waits ahead? In her age, that longing had a whole learned apparatus built to satisfy it, the great and respected art of astrology, which taught that the future was written in the stars for those who had the skill to read it, and it was natural, almost inevitable, that a woman poised as she was, one death away from a crown, should want to consult that art about the very thing on which her whole future turned. The temptation was not strange or wicked in itself. It was human, and it was the age's own science that offered to feed it. But the Church looked on all this with a deep unease, for it touched the oldest of theological wounds, the quarrel between fate and free will, between the stars and the providence of God. If the future was truly written in the heavens, fixed and readable, then where was human freedom? And where was the freedom of God himself, to answer prayer and work miracles and turn the course of things? The learned drew careful distinctions, saying that the stars inclined but did not compel, that they shaped the body and its humours, but could not force the free soul. And by such distinctions astrology was allowed a cautious place among the sciences. But it lived always under suspicion, and there was one application of it that crossed every line, and that was the casting of a king's horoscope to learn the time of his death. For this was not merely to read the future, but to pry into the secret counsels of God concerning the Lord's anointed. And worse, it was held to shade inevitably into wishing that death, and from wishing it into working to bring it about. The law of treason had long taught that even to imagine the king's end was a capital crime, and to seek that death in the stars was to imagine it in the most deliberate way conceivable. Eleanor, in wanting to know whether the crown would come to her husband, had walked straight into the one corner of that respectable science where the axe was waiting. And she was, as we have seen, only one of many across that long age who felt the same weapon fall upon them, for the political sorcery trial was a recurring feature of the times. A pattern repeated whenever the powerful wished to destroy the powerful and reached for the darkest and least answerable of charges. The century before had seen a great king of France break the whole order of the Templars with accusations of devil worship and secret abomination. Charges few truly believed, but which served to seize their wealth and crush their power. Eleanor's own age had seen the Dowager Queen Joan of Navarre struck down by a charge of witchcraft that emptied her coffers into the crown's war chest. And the age that followed hers would see the weapon used again and again in the savage quarrels of the Wars of the Roses. Great ladies and their kin accused of sorcery whenever it suited their enemies, the accusation dusted off and levelled precisely because it was so terrible and so hard to disprove. Eleanor Cobham stands in the middle of this long line of victims, perhaps the most famous of all the English ones, and her case shows the pattern in its clearest form, the real but minor indiscretion seized upon and swollen into a monstrous accusation. The accused destroyed less for what they had done than for what they were and whom they threatened. To see her thus, as one of a long procession of the politically inconvenient, destroyed by the machinery of superstition and law, is not to diminish her, but to place her, to understand that her fall was not a freak, but a symptom, that it belonged to a whole way of doing politics, in which the fear of the devil was one more tool in the hands of ambitious men. It should make us a little slower to believe the confident verdicts of her enemies, and a little more alert to how easily, in any age, a genuine fear can be turned into a false weapon, how readily the anxieties of a society, whatever they happen to be, can be aimed by the powerful at whomever they wish to bring down. The people of the 15th century feared witches as we dread other things, and their fear was real, and it was also, in the hands of clever and ruthless men, a way of destroying enemies while seeming to serve God and the safety of the realm. Eleanor was caught in the machinery of that terror, and it ground her, as it ground so many others, exceedingly small. We should dwell a little, too, on the peculiar danger of the place that Eleanor and Humphrey occupied. For standing next to a throne is in every age among the most perilous positions a person can hold. And their story shows exactly why. The heir presumptive to a childless king lives a strange and double life. On the one hand, he is a great figure, courted and feared, the man in whom the future may lie, around whom hopes and factions gather. On the other side he is, for that very reason, an object of deep suspicion, for every day that the king lives without a child of his own, the heir stands to gain by the king's death, and everyone knows it. And the knowledge poisons everything. A childless king cannot help but look sideways at the man who would succeed him, wondering, and the men about the king cannot help but wonder too, and the heir, however loyal, is watched for any sign that his patience is running thin. It is a position that breeds accusation as naturally as a marsh breeds fever, and Humphrey held it for the whole of his adult life. Always next in line, never quite the king. Always suspect precisely because he had so much to gain from a death. And Eleanor stood beside him in that dangerous place, sharing both its glory and its peril, and in some ways her position was more dangerous still. For a queen in waiting is a more unsettling figure even than a king in waiting. If the horoscope she had cast was a crime, it was a crime that flowed directly from where she stood. For the one question that a woman, a single death from the crown, must be aching to have answered is exactly the forbidden one. When that end will come, her very nearness to the throne made the treasonous curiosity almost inevitable, and made it, when it was discovered, almost impossible to explain away as innocent. This is the cruel logic of the position she held. To be the wife of the heir was to be constantly tempted toward the one thought that was fatal to think, and to be constantly watched by those who expected her to think it. She was placed, by her marriage, in a spot where the very hopes that her situation naturally bred were themselves treason, and where her enemies had only to prove that she had felt what anyone in her place would feel. Few positions in that world combined such height with such danger, and Eleanor occupied one of them, and paid the price that so many who stood too near a crown have paid across the centuries. There is another dimension of her punishment worth pausing over, and that is the deliberate use of shame, of public humiliation as a weapon. For the penance through the streets was not an incidental part of her sentence, but perhaps its very heart. In our own age, we think of punishment chiefly as the taking of liberty or of life, but the medieval world understood, with a clear and pitiless eye, the power of shame, and it built shame into its penalties with great care. It set petty offenders in the pillory to be pelted and jeered at, paraded cheats and scolds through the streets, made penitents walk in the sheet with the candle. It understood that a person standing in the eyes of their neighbours was in a close and watchful society, a possession as real as land or gold, and that to strip it away publicly was to inflict a wound that lasted long after the body had healed. For a woman like Eleanor, whose whole life had been built on rank and precedence and the deference of others, the destruction of her honour before the eyes of all was a punishment exquisitely fitted to hurt, for it attacked the very thing she had climbed her whole life to gain. And there was a symbolic cruelty in the particular form of it, for the penance was quite deliberately a kind of uncrowning, a public reversal of everything her rise had meant. She who had ridden through London in silk and jewels, raised up above the crowd, now walked through the same streets in a plain shift, bareheaded and barefoot, down among the crowd. She who had been served on bended knee now carried her own candle like the humblest penitent. Every detail of the ceremony was the mirror image of her greatness, designed to show, step by barefoot step, that all of it had been taken back, that the Duchess was unmade, that the woman who had reached for a crown now held nothing but a stub of wax. It was punishment as theatre, a public performance of her fall, staged for the instruction of the whole city, and it was meant to live in the memory, as indeed it has, for 600 years. The men who devised it understood the power of images, and they made of Eleanor Cobham an image that would not be forgotten, the great lady walking barefoot with her candle. The very picture of pride brought low, I do not want to leave her only in her shame and her prison, and so let us go back, while the night is still deep, to the brightest of her days, and spend a little while in the world she loved before it was taken from her. Come to one of the Duke's own houses on an evening of high feast, to the fair palace he had raised for himself down the river at Greenwich, where the Thames runs broad and quiet below green hills. A house so pleasant that men gave it names that meant delight and good ease. Come into the great hall on a winter evening, when the light has gone from the river outside, and the hall within is a warm cave of firelight and candlelight. The long tables spread, the fire burning bright on the hearth, the walls hung with rich woven cloths, and the whole company of the Duke's household gathered in their finery beneath the smoke-darkened beams. At the high table, raised above the rest, sit Humphrey and Eleanor side by side. The prince and his duchess, he perhaps in murrey and gold, she in a gown of rich dark velvet, furred at the throat, a fillet of gold and jewels bound about her hair, and the light moving on the plate, and the glass before them. The feast comes in with all its ceremony, course after course borne high from the kitchens, the roasted meats and the great pastries, the dishes coloured gold with saffron and green with herbs, the subtleties of sugar shaped into castles and beasts. The spiced wine poured warm against the cold. There is music through it all, the sweet noise of harp and lute and pipe, drifting under the talk and the laughter, and when the eating is done, there may be dancing in the cleared hall. The slow, grave measures of that age, or a disguising, a mask of costumed players, or the reciting of poetry, for this is a court that loves such things. And Eleanor sits at the centre of it, watched, deferred to, admired, the knight's daughter, who has climbed to the head of the table, mistress of all this warmth and beauty and light, and if you had told her, on such an evening, that it would end in a bare shift and a candle in a cold street, she would have thought you mad. This was the world she had reached for and won, and for a dozen years it was hers, and it was, whatever came after, real, and we do her no wrong to let her keep it a while longer, warm and bright, in the memory of a quiet night like this. And there was another room in the Duke's houses, quieter than the hall, but dearer perhaps to both of them, and that was the library, the chamber of books, and it is worth stepping into as well. For it was the true glory of Humphrey's court, and Eleanor moved in it too. Imagine a long room lined with shelves and presses, and on them the precious volumes, each one a treasure of months of labour, bound in leather and clasped with metal, some blazing with painted letters and gold leaf on their pages. The histories and poems of ancient Rome, the works of the philosophers, the writings of the new scholars of Italy, whom Humphrey drew across the sea. Imagine the scholars themselves, the learned men the Duke kept about him, bent over their desks, copying and translating, and Humphrey among them, no mere collector but a real reader, turning the pages, arguing a point, delighting in a well-turned line. This was the new learning just beginning to break upon the world like a slow dawn, the recovery of the wisdom of the ancients. And Humphrey of Gloucester was one of the very first princes north of the mountains to feel its light and to love it, and to spend his wealth bringing it home. And Eleanor was part of this world, not a stranger to it. A woman of her cleverness and curiosity, married to such a man, moved among the books and the scholars, and caught their restless hunger to know. And it is not hard to see how the same appetite that made the Duke a patron of learning might, in his wife, turn toward the forbidden edges of that learning, toward the reading of the stars and the secrets of what was to come. There is a straight line, in a way, from the library to the scaffold, from the love of knowledge that was the finest thing in that court to the forbidden knowledge that destroyed her, for they sprang from the same root. The same reaching mind that would not be content with the ordinary and the allowed. It is one more of the cruel ironies that thread through her story, that the intellectual brilliance, which was the glory of her husband's court, and which she shared, carried within it the very seed of her ruin. The library and the scaffold were nearer neighbours than they looked, and Eleanor, walking so eagerly among the beautiful, dangerous books, did not see how short the road was from the one to the other. It is worth asking, as clearly as the evidence allows, who it was that benefited from her fall, for in trying to understand a ruin like this, the oldest and surest question is always to ask who gained by it, and the answer is not in much doubt. The men who rose as Humphrey sank, the men into whose hands the government of England was passing in exactly these years, were the old Cardinal Beaufort, Humphrey's lifelong enemy, and the smooth and rising courtier William de la Pole, the Earl of Suffolk, who had the ear of the young king and was fast becoming the real master of the realm. These were the men who wanted Humphrey finished, who had fought him at every turn, whose peace policy his war party threatened, and to whom his continued nearness to the throne was a standing danger. The scandal of Eleanor's sorcery served their purposes so exactly, discrediting the Duke, stripping him of his wife, blackening his household with treason and devilry, that it has always been hard to believe they had no hand in it, or at the least that they did not fall upon it with delight and drive it as hard as it would go. Whether they laid the trap from the beginning, or merely sprang shut a trap that Eleanor's own folly had baited, we cannot now prove either way, and honesty requires us to admit the doubt. But the pattern is suggestive, and the timing is suggestive, and the beneficiaries are plain. And when we set Eleanor's fall beside the long history of such affairs, in which the charge of sorcery so reliably served the interests of the accuser, it is hard not to conclude that her ruin was, at the very least, seized upon and shaped by men who knew exactly what use to make of it. She had given them the raw material through her own indiscretion, and they had fashioned from it a weapon and driven it home. What is certain is that within a few years the same faction had destroyed Humphrey himself, and that Suffolk rode high for a season as the greatest man in England, before he too fell in his turn, hated for the loss of France. Seized and beheaded in a small boat off the coast by his own enemies, for the wheel that had broken Eleanor was turning still, and it broke, one after another, most of those who thought themselves its masters. There is a rough justice in that, if it is any comfort, that the men who used the machinery of ruin so freely upon others were most of them ground up by it in the end themselves, in the long bloodletting that was coming. Step back now from the particular knot of enemies and look at the wider truth her life reveals about what it was to be a woman in that age. For it is one of the things her story shows most sharply. The world Eleanor was born into offered a woman very few paths and watched her narrowly on all of them. She was expected to be obedient, chaste, pious, and quiet, to pass from her father's authority to her husband's without ever holding authority of her own, to find her whole worth in the making of a good marriage and the bearing of children and the ordering of a household. Property and power ran through the male line, and a woman touched them only as a channel, carrying an inheritance from her father to her sons, or wielding a borrowed authority as the wife or widow or mother of a powerful man. There were a very few, who reached real power and held it. Great heiresses, formidable widows, abbesses of rich houses, queens who ruled through weak husbands or infant sons. But they were exceptions, and they were watched with a wariness that shaded quickly into hostility. For a lady with power was felt to be a thing against nature, and the world was always half ready to believe the worst of her. Eleanor was one of those who reached, by the paths available to a clever and beautiful lady, an extraordinary height. She used what she had, her wit, her looks, her place in a great household, the love she could kindle in a prince. And by using them, she climbed further than almost any woman of her birth had ever climbed. In a fairer telling she might be admired for it, for the sheer boldness and skill of the ascent, a knight's daughter who made herself the second lady of a kingdom. But the world she climbed in did not admire such things in a woman. It resented them, feared them, and stood ready to punish them. And when her husband's fortunes failed, and her protection with it, all that stored resentment came down on her at once. Her rise and her ruin together mapped the narrow, dangerous space that an ambitious spirit was allowed to occupy in that age. A space with a high ceiling for the lucky few, but with a trapdoor in the floor, and the trapdoor, for Eleanor, opened. Her story is her own, particular and strange. But it is also the story of what her world did to women who wanted too much and rose too high, and in that it speaks for many who left no record at all. Let us pause, too, over the great might have been that hangs over her whole story, for it is one of the things that gives her fall its peculiar poignancy. When Eleanor had that horoscope cast, she was asking, in effect, whether she would be queen, and it was not an idle or a mad question, for the throne was genuinely, tantalizingly near. The king, Henry VI, remained childless year after year after his marriage, and there would come a time, a little after Eleanor's own death, when he fell into a complete collapse of mind and body and lay for many months insensible, unable to speak or recognize his own newborn son, so that the realm hung in real doubt as to whether he would ever recover or ever leave an heir who could rule. Had the king died childless in those years, as for a long time seemed all too likely, the crown would have passed to the House of Gloucester, and had it happened only a little sooner, before her fall, it would have passed to Humphrey, and Eleanor Cobham, the knight's daughter from the moated manor in Kent, would have been crowned and anointed Queen of England in the Abbey at Westminster. Hold that thought for a moment, for it is an extraordinary one. The whole of her reaching, the whole of her ambition, was aimed at a prize that was not a fantasy, but a real and near possibility, a throne that stood, all that while, only one frail life away. She was not grasping at the impossible, she was grasping at something that might very well have come to pass, and that came within a hair of coming to pass. And it is this that makes her forbidden curiosity about the king's death at once so understandable and so dangerous. She wanted to know whether the thing her whole position pointed toward would actually happen. In the end, it did not. The king lived long enough, in his broken way, to father a son, and that son, born after Eleanor, was already shut up in her island prison, closed the door on the Gloucester succession, forever. The crown that had hovered so near swung away, to be fought over in the coming wars by others. But it had been near, truly near, and Eleanor had felt its nearness, and reached for it, and been destroyed for the reaching, when a slightly different turn of events might have set it on her head and made her the queen. The chroniclers would have had to praise instead of the witch they chose to damn. And there is a strange afterlife to Humphrey's part of the story that is worth setting down here, for it is the one thing out of all their glittering doomed greatness that truly endured. Almost everything the Duke built came to nothing. His marriages ended in annulment and ruin. his wars in defeat, his politics in his own murder, his line in extinction, his very body carried off to a tomb far from the centre of things. But the books survived, or the idea of them did. The great gift of manuscripts he had made to the university at Oxford outlasted him by generations, and though in later, harder times much of that first library was scattered and destroyed, its very destruction was not the end. For the memory of the good Duke's gift lived on, and in a later age a new benefactor refounded the library on the foundation Humphrey had laid. And the oldest and most beautiful room of that great library still carries the Duke's name to this day. So of all the vast ambitions of Humphrey of Gloucester, the thing that survived was the quietest and the least worldly, his love of learning, his gift of books. And students and scholars have sat and read beneath his name for 500 years and more, knowing nothing, most of them, of his politics or his wars or his poor destroyed wife, remembering only that a prince once loved learning enough to give it away. It is a gentler monument than most princes leave, and it is the only part of his world that Eleanor's fall did not, in the end, drag down with it. Let us try, before we come to the end, to reach past the events and the arguments toward the woman herself, for it is the hardest thing to do and the most worth doing. We have almost nothing of her inner life, no letters, no diary, no remembered sayings, only the shape of what she did and what was done to her. And yet even from that shape a person begins to emerge, if we look with patience and with sympathy. She was, first of all, brave. Or at least she had a great and stubborn hardness of spirit, for a weaker woman would have broken under what she endured, and there is no sign that she did. She faced the ecclesiastical court. She walked the 3 days of penance under all those eyes. She went into her long imprisonment, and through all of it, we hear of no collapse, no hysterical confession, no pleading. She endured. Whatever else she was not weak, and she was clever, that shines through everything, a quick and reaching mind that drew her into the world of learning and fatally past its edges. And she was ambitious, hungry for the height and unwilling to be small, and she loved the good things of the world, the silk and the gold and the deference, with a frank and unashamed appetite. We can guess, too, at the loneliness of her end, though she left no word of it, and it is the part of her story that most catches at the heart. Picture the long years in the far castles, a woman past her prime, her beauty fading, her husband dead, her name a byword for shame, sitting through the slow turning of the seasons, with nothing to do but remember. What did she think about, in all those hours? Did she go over and over the choices that had brought her there? The visit to the wise woman, the casting of the horoscope, the whole reaching ambition that had lifted her so high and dropped her so far. Did she blame herself, or her enemies, or the blind turning of fortune's wheel? Did she remember the good years, the feasts and the books and the deference, and did the memory comfort her or torment her? Did she pray? Did she hope, in the early years, for some rescue or reversal? And when did that hope die? We cannot know any of it. She sat in her tower by the sea and kept her own counsel as she had learned to do, and took whatever she felt into the silence with her. But the human being was there, behind the silence, feeling all the things a human being feels. And it is right to remember that the figure in the chronicles was a living woman who suffered a long, slow, lonely ruin, and not merely a moral in a story. And there is one last comparison that lays bare, more sharply than anything, the injustice at the heart of her treatment. And it is the comparison between how the world chose to remember her and how it chose to remember Humphrey. They were partners in ambition, the two of them equally hungry, equally reaching, equally caught up in the great game that destroyed them both. Humphrey's ambitions did real and public harm. his reckless foreign war endangered the whole English cause. His quarrels poisoned the politics of the realm for 20 years, and he was, by any measure, at least as guilty as his wife of overreaching and grasping and putting his own advancement above the good of the kingdom. And yet the world remembered him as the good Duke Humphrey, the wronged and gentle prince, the patron of learning, the man half mourned as a murdered innocent, while it remembered her as a witch, a schemer, a byword for the sin of a woman who climbed too high. He kept his good name and gained a warm legend. She lost her name and became a warning. The same reaching ambition that was forgiven in the prince, even admired, was in the woman turned into devilry and disgrace. There is nothing accidental in that difference. It is the plain working of a world that judged men and women by wholly different measures, that allowed a man to be ambitious and called it greatness, and punished a woman for the same thing and called it witchcraft. Humphrey overreached and was pitied. Eleanor overreached and was damned. And the damning has largely stuck, for she comes down to us still, when she comes down at all, chiefly as the sorceress Duchess, the one who melted the king in wax, the fable of pride and black arts, while he comes down as the kindly duke with his beloved books. Part of what we are doing here tonight, in this slow and patient telling, is a small act of setting the balance right, of looking at the two of them with the same eye, and seeing that if he deserves his sympathy, then so, and more, does she, who did less harm and suffered far more, and whose only unforgivable crime, in the end, was her own ambition, in a world made by and for ambitious men. Spare a thought, before we draw toward the close, for the poorest and most wholly forgotten of all those caught in the net with her, the cunning woman, Marjorie Germain, the Witch of Eye. For her story opens a window onto a whole hidden world beneath the Great One. She came of the villages just outside Westminster, in the low watery ground called Eye, and she made her living, as many such women did, by the selling of small magic. In every village and every crowded town parish there were such wise women and cunning men, folk who knew the old law, the properties of herbs, the words of the charms handed down, and who sold their skills to their neighbours for a few pence. A potion for a sick child or a sick cow, a charm to bring back a straying husband or find a stolen spoon, a remedy for a barren woman who longed to conceive. Most people used them without a second thought, for they filled a real need in a world with little medicine and much fear. And the line between their homely magic and the prayers and blessings of the church was, in ordinary life, blurred and easily crossed. Marjorie had a name for being cleverer or bolder than most, and her clients seemed to have reached higher than the usual run of anxious villagers, for a great lady of the court had come to her, and that was her undoing. She had been in the hands of the law before, for her sorceries, and had been released with a warning, and that mercy became, in the end, her death sentence. For it made her a relapsed offender when they took her the second time. She was the one member of the whole company who had neither rank nor learning to shield her, neither a duchess's blood nor a scholar's standing. Only her poverty and her reputation and her dangerous trade, and so it was she who paid the fullest and cruelest price. Burned alive at Smithfield, while the great lady who had bought her potions walked in penance and lived. There is no colder illustration in the whole affair of how justice bent itself to rank, of how the same net caught a duchess and a village-wise woman and dealt out shame to the one and the fire to the other. We know almost nothing of Marjorie Germain beyond her trade and her terrible end, but she deserves her moment in the telling. The poor cunning woman of the marshes, who was drawn up into the quarrels of the mighty and burned for it, the one who could not walk away. And behind all of it, watching, cheering, jeering, stood the great city of London itself, which was as much a character in Eleanor's story as any of the players, and it is worth conjuring up as it was in her day. Picture the walled city on the north bank of the broad grey Thames, its huddle of steep roofs and its 100 church spires pricking the smoke. Crowned by the vast bulk of the old Cathedral of St. Paul with its spire, the tallest thing for miles, rising over all. Picture the single great bridge across the river, crowded along its length with houses and shops, so that a man might cross it and hardly know he was over water. And above its gate, the grim spectacle of the traitors' heads on their poles. Tarred and weathering, the astrologer Bolingbroke's own head among them in that year. Picture the narrow streets below, packed and noisy and stinking, the open channels running down their middles, the shops with their signs and their open fronts, the cries of the sellers, the press of people, the carts and the horses, and the driven beasts. The friars and the merchants and the apprentices and the beggars, the whole roaring, crowded, filthy, vivid life of a great medieval city. This was the London that had cheered Humphrey as its good duke, that loved his open hand and his hatred of the proud cardinal, and that had bent the knee to Eleanor in her glory as she rode by in silk and gold. And this was the city that turned out in its thousands when her hour came, to watch her creep past barefoot with her candle, the same streets, the same faces. The cheers turned to a hard and hungry curiosity. London had made much of her in her rising, and it made a spectacle of her in her fall. For a great city loves a show above all things. And there was no greater show in that whole year than the unmaking of a duchess. She had been its darling, and she became its warning. And the streets that had blazed with welcome for her blazed now only with the cold light of the November sky on the cobbles she walked barefoot. It outlived her, as such places do, and forgot her mostly, as they always do, keeping only the one bright, terrible image of the barefoot woman with the candle, which is perhaps the only thing most who remember her at all remember still. When we gather up the whole of her life and hold it in the mind at once, what strikes most is its shape, the pure dramatic completeness of the arc. From silence to blazing light and back into silence again. She came out of the unrecorded dark, a knight's daughter in a country manor, so obscure that we cannot even name the year she was born. She rose through service and wit and beauty and a prince's love to the very summit of her world, a duchess robed in gold, one death from a crown, the second lady of a kingdom. And then she fell, in the turning of a single year, from that summit all the way down, past shame and imprisonment, back into an obscurity as deep as the one she had come from, dying a forgotten prisoner in a far castle, her grave itself lost to us. Out of the dark and into the dark, with one great blaze of light between, and the blaze so bright and the shadow on either side so complete that the whole thing has the shape less of a life than of a fable. A rising and a falling star, a thing that seems almost designed to teach a lesson. And yet the lesson it teaches is not quite the simple one her own age drew from it. The tidy warning against pride and ambition and forbidden arts. The deeper lesson, the one we can see more clearly across the distance of the centuries, is a harder and a sadder thing about power and fear and the uses men make of both. Her life shows us how a whole society's deepest terror, in her case the fear of witchcraft and the devil, can be taken up by the powerful and turned into a weapon against whomever they wish to destroy, and how the machinery of law and religion can be bent to serve the ends of faction, while seeming to serve God and the safety of the realm. It shows us how a woman who reached for power was watched and feared and, when her moment of weakness came, torn down with a savagery that the same world would never have visited on a man. And it shows us how easily a real but ordinary human, failing, ambition, curiosity, the longing to know the future or to bear a child, can be seized and swollen into a monstrous crime by those who have decided, for reasons of their own, that a person must fall, These are not lessons that belong only to the 15th century. They are about power and fear and scapegoats and the vulnerability of the ambitious, and they have not lost their force. And they are part of why her strange old story still has the force to disturb us. But I would not have you carry away from this evening only the darkness of it, for there is something else in her story too, harder to name but just as real. And that is a kind of stubborn human dignity that survives even her ruin. She reached, and she reached too high, and she was struck down for it, but she dared. And there is something in the sheer boldness of the ascent that commands a reluctant admiration. A knight's daughter from a moated manor made herself the second woman in England. She did not stay in the small safe place the world had marked out for. She wanted more, and she went and got it, and held it for a dozen shining years. And if the getting of it and the losing of it destroyed her, she had at least lived, for a while, at the very height of her world, which is more than most who are born, where she was born, ever glimpse. And when it was all taken from her, she did not break. She walked her penance upright. She endured her long imprisonment without a recorded word of collapse. She kept her own counsel to the end. There is a hard courage in that, a refusal to be wholly unmade even by so complete a ruin, and it is worth honouring alongside the pity. She was not only a victim and not only a warning, she was also a woman of great spirit who dared greatly and paid the whole price of the daring. And there is a bleak grandeur in that which her enemies could not take from her, and which the centuries have not quite worn away. There is a quiet comfort, is there not, in sitting up late with a life so long finished, in following a woman all the way from her first obscurity to her last, knowing the end before we begin, watching the bright noon that does not know the evening is coming. It is a strange thing to say of so sad a story, and yet it is true, for all the fear and the striving and the grief that filled Eleanor's days are 600 years stilled now. Come down at last to a name in a chronicle, and a candle in a cold street, and a lost grave by the sea. Whatever she suffered, she has finished suffering. Whatever she dreaded through those long years in the far castles, the dread is over. The whole vast, anxious weight of her ambition, the plots and the fears and the sleepless nights, has folded itself away into a story we can hold gently in the mind on a quiet night and then set down. And there is a kind of peace in that, in the knowledge that even the sharpest griefs are borne at last into stillness, that the wheel which lifted her so high and dropped her so low turns on past every sorrow into silence and rest. And our own cares, the small anxious things we carry into the night with us, the worries that loom so large in the dark hours, they too will one day be so folded away, so stilled, so gently laid down. And there is more comfort in that thought than fear, if we let there be. For it means that nothing we dread tonight is as heavy as it feels, that the very things that seem, at 3 a.m, too much to be borne, will pass and soften and be forgotten as surely as a duchess's terror in a Welsh castle has passed. The people of Eleanor's age knew this in their bones, for all their fear of the wheel of fortune, and it was to them a stern comfort as well as a warning that nothing lasts. That the great fall and the low rise and all alike come to rest at the end, and that the only wise course is to hold the things of this world lightly. Since fortune will in any case take them all back, it is a hard wisdom, but there is rest in it. And it is the kind of wisdom that these old stories carry down to us, if we listen, under the drama and the sorrow. And there is one small bright gleam that runs like a thread through the whole of her story, and I have saved it for the last. And it is a candle. Think how the light of candles falls across her life from beginning to end. In the good years, the candles burned in their hundreds down the long tables of the Duke's Hall, and stood on the altars of the churches, where she made her offerings in silk and gold, and lit the beautiful books in the Duke's library, where she bent her clever head among the scholars. Light and warmth and beauty, the candles of her greatness. And then, at the end of it all, there was one candle more, a single taper of plain wax put into her bare hand to be carried through the cold streets. The penitent's candle. The humble little flame that was all that was left to her of all that blazing light. From the 100 golden candles of the feast to the one poor taper in the street, that is the whole of her fall told in a single image, and there is something almost unbearably apt in it. That the woman who had lived amid so much brightness should have it all narrowed down at the last to the one small flame she carried in shame. And yet a candle, even the poorest, gives a glow. And there is a way of seeing that last taper not only as a symbol of her shame, but as something gentler. For a candle carried through the dark is also the oldest image we have of a small flame kept alive against the night, of memory, of the soul, of the flame that is not quite put out. She bore it through the streets in her humiliation, but she carried it, she did not let it fall. And something in that stubborn little flame, kept burning in the cold by a disgraced and barefoot woman, seems to speak of the hard endurance that was the truest thing in her. And tonight, in a way, we have lit it again, this small light of her memory, and let it burn a while in the dark and given her back, for a few quiet hours, the attention that the centuries denied her. That is a thing worth doing, to keep a faint flame burning for the forgotten, and it is very near to what these long, slow tellings are for. Her case belongs to a larger and darker current that was just then beginning to gather across Europe, and it is worth noting where she stands in it, for it gives her private ruin a wider and more ominous meaning. The middle years of the 15th century, her own years, were the very time when the learned fear of witchcraft was hardening into the shape that would in the centuries after loose the great witch hunts upon the Western world. Scholars and inquisitors were beginning to write the treatises that taught that witches were not deluded old women, but real and organized servants of the devil, bound to him by pact, gathering in secret, working genuine harm by his power. The old, half-tolerated world of village, charms and cunning folk was being drawn, in the minds of the learned, into a single terrible conspiracy against God and Christendom. And a great, public, high-placed case like Eleanor's, a duchess and her astrologers, and a wax image aimed at the king, fed exactly this growing fear, seemed to prove that the danger was real and reached even into palaces, and helped to fix in English minds the deadly link between sorcery and treason. She was, without knowing it, a figure near the beginning of a long and cruel chapter, one of the early famous victims of a fear that would, in the generations after her, send many thousands, most of them poor women like Marjorie Germain, rather than great ladies like herself, to the fire and the gallows. There is a grim continuity there, from the wax image melted before a fire in 1441 to the mass terrors of the centuries that followed, and Eleanor's case sits near its head. A warning of what was coming. The same ingredients that destroyed her, the genuine belief in the reality of the devil's work, the ease with which ordinary acts could be dressed as sorcery, the usefulness of the charge to those who wished to destroy an enemy, the special vulnerability of women, would all recur again and again on an ever greater scale as the fear spread and deepened. To read her story is to catch an early, aristocratic glimpse of a horror that would later fall most heavily on the humble and the friendless. She had rank enough to keep her life, where thousands after her would not. But the machinery that caught her was the same machinery, and it was only warming to its work. Let us turn, though, from the darkness of what was coming back to the woman herself, and ask one last gentle question about her, which is whether, in all that long ruin, she found any peace at the end. We cannot know, of course, for she left no word of her inner life. But it is worth remembering that penance, in the mind of her age, was not meant only as punishment and shame. It was also, in the Church's teaching, a road to redemption, a way by which even the worst sinner might be cleansed and restored to grace, and the walking of it, however bitter, carried at least the possibility of a spiritual healing. And the long years of imprisonment that followed, empty and lonely as they were also, whether she willed it or not, a kind of enforced retreat from the world, a stripping away of all the silk and the gold and the deference she had loved, until nothing was left but the bare soul and the sea and the sky and whatever she could make of them. It is possible, and I like to think it, that somewhere in those long quiet years the proud, ambitious, reaching woman found a kind of peace she had never had time for in her days of greatness. That the loss of everything the world could give left room, at last, for something the world could not take. We cannot know it, but the possibility is there. And on a gentle night, it is a kinder thing to hold than the picture of unbroken bitterness. And it may even be the truer one. For the human soul is stubborn in its search for peace, and finds it, sometimes, in the least likely of places, even in a prison by the sea. And here is a last thought to lay beside her story, one that her own age would have relished. For the wheel of fortune that carried Eleanor down did not stop turning when it had done with her, but came round in time for very nearly all of those who had brought her low, and their ends were, most of them, as hard as hers. The smooth Earl of Suffolk, who rose so high on the ruin of the House of Gloucester and made himself the master of England, was hated at last for the loss of France, driven from power, banished, and then seized in a ship in the Channel by his enemies, and beheaded over the side of a small boat with a rusty sword, his body cast up on the sands of Dover. The old Cardinal Beaufort, Humphrey's lifelong foe, died rich in his bed, but not, the story went, in peace. For tales gathered about his deathbed of a man clutching at his gold and terrified to die. The king himself, gentle broken Henry, lost his wits and then his throne, was deposed and restored and deposed again in the wars that came, and ended murdered in the Tower of London, quietly done away, with like Richard before him. His fierce Queen Margaret, who had taken the place Eleanor once reached for, saw her only son killed in battle and her cause destroyed, and died at last a poor and broken exile in the land of her birth. One after another the wheel took them, the persecutors and the powerful, and ground them as small as it had ground the Duchess in her island prison. There is no need to make too neat a moral of it, for the world is not really so tidy, and plenty of the wicked die warm in their beds while the innocent suffer. But there is at least a rough and bracing truth in it, the truth the people of that age saw so clearly in their wheel, that no height is safe, that the mighty who destroy others are so often destroyed in their turn, that the same forces of faction and fear and violence which a powerful man looses upon his enemy have a way of circling back to loose themselves upon him. Eleanor was caught early in the great unravelling of that generation, one of the first to go down, and from her cell by the sea. Had she known of it, she might have taken a bleak satisfaction in watching, one by one, the ruin of nearly all who had ruined her, as the kingdom they had fought over so viciously fell to pieces in their hands and buried most of them in the wreckage. The wheel is no respecter of persons. It lifted the knight's daughter to a coronet and dropped her to a prison, and it lifted her enemies to power and dropped them to the block and the battlefield and the lonely exile. And it turns, the old moralists would say, turning still. For all of us, and the only wisdom is to remember that it turns, and to hold what we are given lightly, and to be kind while we are near the top, since none of us stays there long. Before we let her go, it is worth asking what her story asks of us. We who look back at her across so great a gulf of years, for the way we choose to remember the long dead is a kind of quiet moral act. Her own age judged her harshly and simply. The proud witch justly brought low, and it closed the book on her with a satisfied moral and moved on. It would be easy for us to judge her simply in the other direction, to make her a pure and blameless victim of male cruelty and superstition, a martyr with no faults at all, but neither of these is the truth, and neither is quite fair to the living woman, who was, like all of us, a mixture. Brave and grasping, clever and reckless, sinned against far more than sinning, but not without her own share of folly and ambition. What her story asks of us, I think, is the harder and better thing, which is to hold the whole of her at once, to see the ambition and the courage together, the folly and the cruelty done to her together, and to judge. If we must judge at all, with the mercy that comes from remembering how little we know, and how easily any of us might, in her place and her age, have done as she did, and fallen as she fell. For that is the deepest gift these old lives can give us, if we let them, a kind of widening of sympathy across the centuries, a reminder that the people of the past were not simpler or wickeder or braver than we are, but exactly as human, as tangled, as capable of good and ill, as caught in the currents of their time as we are caught in ours. Eleanor reached for more than her world would let her have, and paid for it, and in the reaching and the paying she is not a stranger to us, but a sister, near kin to every one of us who has ever wanted more than we were given, or feared the future, or tried to peer ahead into the dark, or been judged more harshly than we deserved. To spend a slow night in her company is not to sit in judgment on a distant sinner, but to keep faith, for a little while, with a fellow human being who lived and hoped and suffered long ago, and that keeping of faith is worth something, both to her memory and to ourselves. Set 2 days side by side, if you will, one from the height of her greatness, and one from the depth of her fall. For nothing shows the completeness of her ruin so plainly as the plain contrast of how her hours were spent before and after. Think of a single day at the summit, a day at the Duke's house in the good years. She wakes in a great curtained bed in a painted chamber, and her women come to dress her, to lace her into a gown of velvet and fur, to bind up her hair and set the jewels on her. She hears mass in a chapel bright with gilding, a chaplain of her own at the altar. She breaks her fast, and then there is the long business of a great lady's day, the ordering of her household, the receiving of petitioners who come seeking her favour, the writing of letters, the audiences, perhaps a ride out with a train of attendants, perhaps an hour among the books, and then the great feast of the evening with its music and its ceremony, and the slow torchlit progress at last to bed. Every hour of it is filled with people, with deference, with the soft exercise of power, with beauty and warmth and the constant quiet reassurance of her own high place in the world. Now set beside it a day from the long years after, in the castle by the sea. She wakes in a plain chamber, and if any woman attends her now, it is a keeper's servant, not a lady of noble blood. There is no petitioner, for she has no favour left to give. There is no audience, no letter to write, for the world has forgotten her, and she has nothing to say to it. There is the Mass, perhaps, if a priest is allowed her, and there is the long, empty, unmarked stretch of the hours, the same walls, the same view of the water and the mountains, the same slow round of a life in which nothing happens and nothing is expected to happen ever again. She eats what her keepers give her. She walks, it may be, in a guarded yard. She sits at her window and watches the tide. And that is all, day after day, season after season, year upon year, until she dies. The contrast between the 2 days is the whole measure of the fall, and it is the crueler for being so quiet. For she was not tortured and not starved, only emptied, her days drained of everything that had once filled them, and left to sit in the long silence and remember what they had been. And it is worth pausing too on the thing that did more than any spell to destroy her, which was not sorcery at all, but rumour, the soft, ceaseless murmur of gossip that had followed her from the first day of her rise. Long before there was any charge against her, there was talk, the talk that always gathered about a woman who had climbed as she had climbed. The whispers that she had won the Duke by unfair arts, that no honest means could account for so steep an ascent, that there was something not right about her, something to be watched. In a world without our floods of news, rumour was a mighty power, the chief way that reputations were made and unmade, and it worked slowly and invisibly, a word here and a word there, a raised eyebrow, a knowing look, until a whole picture of a person had been built up in the common mind, half true and half malice, and hardened there past all changing. For years that murmur had followed Eleanor, harmless seeming, no more than the ordinary envy that trails the fortunate, and all the while it was laying the ground for her ruin, preparing the whole court and the whole city to believe the worst of her the moment the worst was charged. So that when the day came and the accusation was made, it did not fall on unprepared ground. It fell on a soil long seeded with suspicion, and it grew there with terrible speed, because everyone had, in a sense, been half expecting it, had always known there was something dark about the upstart Duchess, had heard the whispers for years. This is how reputation kills, not in a sudden blow, but by long preparation, so that the final accusation is only the flower of a poison that has been growing quietly for a decade. Eleanor could no more defend herself against the accumulated weight of years of rumour than she could against the charge of witchcraft itself. For the two were really one, the whispered suspicion and the formal charge, and both drew their power from the same source. The readiness of her world to believe that a woman who had risen so high must have done something wicked to do it. She was convicted, in the deepest sense, long before her trial, in 1,000 small conversations she never heard. And by the time the matter came to the bishops, the verdict had in truth already been reached, in the slow court of gossip, where she had never had a chance to speak in her own defence. It helps to understand the particular kind of imprisonment that held her, for it was a thing peculiar to that age and its rankings, the honourable captivity of the great. And Eleanor was far from alone in it. The medieval world had a whole custom of holding high-born prisoners, not in dungeons and chains, but in a comfortable, guarded confinement fitted to their station. A captivity that could be gentle in its daily texture, and yet absolute and unending. Her own century was full of such prisoners. A prince of France, Charles of Orleans, taken as a young man at the great battle where Humphrey was wounded, was held in England for a quarter of a century, moved from castle to castle, much as Eleanor would be, and passed the long years writing exquisite poetry of longing for his lost freedom and his lost land. A king of Scotland had been held captive in England for the better part of 2 decades. Kings and dukes and counts taken in war, rival claimants to thrones, inconvenient heirs, all might spend years or a lifetime in this soft iron confinement, kept in a manner befitting their blood, and yet never, ever allowed to go. So Eleanor's captivity, grievous as it was, followed a well-worn pattern, and it is worth seeing it in that light, for it tells us something about how her world thought. Rank did not save you from ruin, but it shaped the form your ruin took. A great person could not simply be flung in a common jail like a thief for their blood, or the blood they had married into, demanded a certain treatment even in disgrace. And so the age devised this curious institution. The prison that was also a household, the captivity with servants and decent food, and a chamber with a view, which stripped away liberty and hope while preserving the outward forms of dignity. It was, in its way, a very medieval kind of cruelty, courteous and absolute at once, and Eleanor endured it in exactly the manner the custom prescribed. A fallen great lady kept in guarded comfort at the edge of the realm, wanting for nothing except the one thing that mattered, which was any prospect of an end short of death. There is a strange loneliness peculiar to that kind of captivity, worse in some ways than the loneliness of a dungeon. For it is a loneliness dressed in the daily forms of a life that has had all its meaning taken out. She had servants to attend her, but they were her keeper's servants, not her own. She had chambers to live in, but they were her prison. She had the outward shape of a great lady's existence, the meals and the mass and the walks and the sewing, but emptied of everything that had given that existence its purpose, the power, the society, the love, the sense of a future. It was her old life turned into a hollow shell, the motions of it continuing while the substance was gone, and she had to live inside that shell, day after day. For more than a decade, one can imagine that the very comfort of it made it harder to bear, that it would almost have been easier to rage against chains than to sit in a decent chamber with nothing to rage against, but the soft, unbreakable, endless fact of confinement. She was not tormented, she was simply held, gently and forever, and left to feel the whole weight of a life reduced to waiting for its own end. We should give her more credit, too, than the chroniclers ever did for the sheer skill of her rise. For to climb as she climbed was no accident of a pretty face, but a real and difficult achievement in the hard school of the great household. The noble household of that age was many things at once. It was a home and a court and a small government. But it was also a ladder and a marriage market and a school of manners. And for a clever young woman of the gentry, it was very nearly the only path by which she might rise above the station of her birth. To be placed as a girl in the household of a great lady was itself a mark of a family's good connections, and once there, a young woman's whole future depended on how well she played the delicate game of service, on making herself useful and agreeable and noticed, on winning the favour of her mistress and the good opinion of the great people who came and went, on catching, if she could, the eye of some man of higher rank than she could otherwise have hoped for. It was a world of watchfulness and subtlety, of knowing when to speak and when to be silent, of reading the shifting currents of favour. And the women who rose in it were not fools or ornaments, but shrewd and capable players of a hard game. Eleanor played that game better than almost anyone of her time, and we should see the skill in it even if we cannot admire every move. She came into Jacqueline's service, one gentlewoman among several, with nothing but her wit and her looks and her wits again to distinguish her. And she came out of it as the beloved of the first prince of the blood, and in time, his duchess. That is not the story of a passive girl to whom things merely happened. It is the story of a woman who saw her chance and took it, who made herself indispensable to a powerful man, who navigated the treacherous passage from a wife's attendant to the wife's supplanter, and came through it not disgraced, but crowned with a duchess's coronet. Whatever we think of the means, the achievement was formidable, and it took intelligence and nerve and a cool sense of how power and desire actually worked in that world. The chroniclers, disapproving, saw only a scheming woman and a fallen one. We can see, if we choose something more, a person of real ability making the most of the very few cards her world had dealt her, and playing them for a long time brilliantly. There is no shame in that, whatever her age thought, or there need be none in our eyes. She was born into a world that gave a woman almost no honest path to greatness except through the favour of men. That told her from birth that her whole worth lay in the marriage she could make, and then condemned her for making the most spectacular marriage her gifts could reach. She did what her age had taught her to do, and did it superbly, and was punished not because she had broken the rules of the game, but because she had won it too well. and because the man on whose fortunes her own depended could not hold his place. To rise as she rose took everything a lady was permitted to use, and she used it all, and for a dozen years it worked. The tragedy is not that she played the game, but that the game was rigged against her from the start, so that even total victory in it left her, in the end, one man's downfall away from total ruin. She had climbed as high as the ladder went, and discovered that the ladder was propped against a wall that others could pull down whenever they chose. There is one more current running beneath her story that we should bring up into the light before we close, and it is the deepest and the oldest of them all. The peculiar dread that her age felt toward a woman who reached for power. A dread with roots that ran down into the very foundations of how that world understood the sexes. The learned men of the church taught, and most people believed, that woman was by her created nature the weaker and the more dangerous vessel, more governed by passion than by reason, more open to temptation, the daughter of that first Eve through whom, the old story ran, sin and death had come into the world. From this came a deep and settled suspicion of women in general, and of ambitious women, above all, a sense that one who reached beyond her ordained place, who sought knowledge or power or mastery, was not merely stepping out of line, but working against the natural and divine order of things, and was therefore peculiarly open to the whisperings of the devil, who had found in the first woman his easiest door. It is no accident, then, that the charge which destroyed Eleanor was witchcraft, for of all crimes it was the one most deeply bound up with this fear of the dangerous female. To accuse a powerful, ambitious lady of sorcery was to give a name and a shape to an unease that her very existence already stirred, to say aloud what the age half believed anyway, that a lady who had climbed so high and reached so far must be in league with darkness, for how else could such a one have done it? The accusation fitted the ancient prejudice like a key in a lock. It took the general dread of female ambition and focused it, in Eleanor, to a killing point. And it drew its terrible plausibility from centuries of teaching about the weakness and the danger and the devilish susceptibility of women. She was destroyed, in the last and deepest analysis, not only by particular enemies with particular grudges, but by a whole civilization's fear of what a woman might become if she were let reach too high. A fear far older than she was, and one that would outlast her by centuries, and claim in the dark years to come a vast and mostly nameless multitude of her sisters. To understand that is to understand the last thing about her, which is that her story, for all its strange particular details of horoscopes and wax and cunning women, is at bottom a very simple and a very ancient one. It is the story of a woman who wanted more than her world would let her have, and who was destroyed for the wanting, and dressed in the destroying, in the age's darkest costume of devilry and shame. Strip away the 15th century trappings, and it is a story that has been told, in one form or another, in almost every age, wherever one has risen high enough to frighten the men around her, and been pulled down with whatever weapon lay nearest to hand. That is why she is worth remembering, and worth remembering kindly, for she was one of countless women broken on that ancient wheel, and one of the few whose breaking was loud enough to leave a mark on the record, so that in remembering her we remember, in a way, all the others whose names are wholly lost. It is a curious thing, and a poignant one, that for all her fame we do not know her face. No sure likeness of Eleanor Cobham has come down to us. No painting, no carved tomb effigy with her features on it. Nothing but the bare word of the chroniclers that she was beautiful, which is a word they use so freely of any great lady that it tells us almost nothing at all. We know the shape of her life in extraordinary detail, the horoscope and the trial and the penance and the prison. And yet we cannot picture the woman who lived it, cannot say whether she was fair or dark, tall or small, what her voice was like, how she held herself, What look came into her eyes when she was pleased or afraid? She is to us a life without a face, a figure known entirely by her deeds and her fate, and not at all by her person. And there is something strange and sad in that. That so vivid a story should belong to so invisible a woman. It is a fate she shares with almost all the women of her age below the very highest rank, for the making of a likeness was costly and rare, reserved for kings and queens and the greatest of the great. And even among those, the women were painted far less often than the men. So the ordinary run of gentlewomen, even wealthy and powerful ones, even a duchess, passed through the world and out of it, leaving no image behind, their faces dying with the last person who remembered them. We are left, when we try to picture Eleanor, to furnish her face ourselves from imagination, to give her whatever features the mind supplies, knowing that we are almost certainly wrong, and that the real woman, the particular living face that turned to the light in the Duke's bright hall and set hard beneath the jeering on the day of her penance, is gone beyond all recovery. We can know her story to the last detail and never once see her. And that gap, that faceless famous woman at the centre of so loud a tale, is perhaps the truest emblem of how the past keeps some of its secrets forever, however much of the rest it yields. So let us gather up, as we always do at the end, the few images that stay in the mind when the arguments and the dates have all slipped away. For these are what remain of a life when the rest is forgotten. Hold the child in the moated manner among the Kentish hills, learning her needle and her prayers, with no notion of the height and the depth that waited for her. Hold the clever young woman in the great princess's chamber, catching the eye of the brilliant, reckless duke. Hold the knight's daughter made a duchess, robed in gold at the head of the feast, one death from a crown. See her bent over the forbidden charts by candlelight, asking the stars the one question she should never have asked. Recall the barefoot figure with the taper in her hand, walking the cold streets of London while the city she had ruled above turned out to watch her shame. And keep, at the last, the aging prisoner at her narrow window in the castle by the sea, looking out over the bright water to the far blue mountains, keeping her own silent counsel to the end. That is the shape of her, from the moated manor to the sea-girt prison, and it is time, gently, to lay the whole of it down. And as we lay it down, let us leave her, not in her shame and not in her prison, but in the one place where she was happiest, back in the good years, in the warm hall of the Duke's fair house by the river, with the candles burning down the long tables, and the music drifting under the beams, and Humphrey beside her, and all the disasters still far off and unguessed. Let her keep that, the light and the warmth and the love and the height she had climbed to, for it was real, and it was hers, and she won it against every odd the world had set against a knight's daughter. Whatever came after, she had that, and we do her no wrong, and ourselves no harm to leave her there, in the candlelight at the top of the wheel before it began to turn. Let us close the door softly on that bright hall, and on the clever, ambitious, courageous woman at the head of it, and step out quietly into the dark, and leave her to her evening of happiness, which no enemy, and no chronicle, and no turning wheel can ever quite take away. So let the story do for you tonight what these old tellings are for, which is to lift you gently up out of your own hours and carry you through someone else's, to loosen the grip of the day and set the mind drifting down the long corridors of the years until it grows heavy and still. You have kept company tonight with a whole life, from a nameless year in a moated manor in Kent to a lonely death in a castle by the western sea. A knight's daughter who climbed by her wit and her courage to the very edge of a crown, who was cast down by fear and malice and her own reaching pride, who walked barefoot through a jeering city with a candle in her hand, and who bore her long imprisonment to the end without a word of breaking. It is a long way we have come together, from the green Kentish hills to the grey walls of Beaumaris, and there is nothing left now but to let it go, and to let yourself go with it, down into the soft dark, where the stories and the cares of the day all dissolve alike. Let her rest now, Eleanor Cobham, the Duchess and the prisoner, whom the world used harshly in her life and half forgot in her death, and to whom we have given back, for these few quiet hours, a little of the attention and the sympathy she was so cruelly denied. She lived 600 years ago, and every fear that kept her wakeful and every grief that weighed on her is quieted now, folded away into the deep peace that takes us all in the end, and there is comfort in that, both for her and for us. The wheel that lifted her and dropped her turns for all of us in our turn. And it is best, the old wisdom says, to hold the things of this world lightly, to be kind while we are near the top, and to remember, when we lie awake, that nothing we dread is as heavy as it feels in the dark, and that morning always comes. Before I leave you to your rest, let me say only this. If keeping company with a long-ago life, told softly and without hurry, is something that has suited these few hours we have spent together, then you are welcome to stay and welcome to subscribe, so that on another such night, one more life will be waiting here for you. What I do here is a simple thing. I seek out the men and women whom time has let slip. The ones who deserve to be remembered a little more gently than their own age chose to remember them. And I give to each of them an unhurried evening like the one you and I have shared. There is nothing at all you need do about it now. Only let the thought settle somewhere at the back of your mind, that whenever you wish to pass such an evening again, beside someone the years have overlooked, this is a place where one will always be here for you. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.